Chapter 666. The news of Heidi Klum being fired by Eric on the spot for violating the ban spread like wildfire. The Victoria's Secret angels, who had been pursued by the media, calmed down when they heard the inside story. The Victoria's Secret fashion show had always attracted a lot of media attention. During this period of time, the darling of the modeling industry had suddenly fallen from the clouds. This kind of explosive news could not be hidden, and the Victoria's Secret fashion show team had no intention of hiding it. On the day Eric made this decision, Heidi Klum's personal page on Yahoo was removed. Some of the publicity activities that required Heidi Klum's participation were also changed. Edward Razek, one of the people in charge of the Victoria's Secret fashion show, even made an official announcement at the Plaza Hotel where the Victoria's Secret angels were staying. However, this news obviously didn't satisfy the media reporters who were thirsty for any news about the Victoria's Secret fashion show. Countless inquiries from the media flooded in. All the people in charge of the Victoria's Secret fashion show and the Metropolitan Model Agency that Heidi Klum belonged to were in an attempt to dig up more details. Almost all the media didn't believe that Heidi Klum was fired because of the exclusive interview in Vogue New York magazine. Most people thought that the exclusive interview was specially arranged by the program team. After all, just like how various kinds of news would be released in stages during the promotion process to maintain the popularity of the topic, the article in New York Vogue was very similar to the usual movie promotion method. Some of the more sinister media even guessed that there might be some kind of scandal involved, so they became even more eager to dig up. However, no matter how many calls were made, and how many people who might know the inside story were contacted, all the news obtained by the media was exactly the same as the official statement. Not only was this the truth, but after this incident, the Victoria's Secret angels who had put zippers on their little mouths didn't dare to say anything to the media even in private. Some of the project team staff who knew about the incident wouldn't say anything. The Victoria's Secret angels had made a mistake, but at most, they would lose this opportunity. They had signed a stricter confidentiality agreement, so if they said anything, not only would they lose their jobs, but they would also receive a huge compensation. Other than the Victoria's Secret project team and the Metropolitan Model Agency, the only person who knew the whole story was Heidi Klum, who had been fired by Eric. However, when countless reporters began to contact Heidi Klum, they once again discovered a shocking fact. This Victoria's Secret angel who had just been fired had actually vanished from the face of the earth. Not only did all of Heidi Klum's contact with her manager fail, but even some well-connected reporters who managed to contact Heidi Klum's relatives in Germany were unable to find out her whereabouts. As a result, the media became even more excited, and all kinds of speculations became even more rampant. Although the regular large media outlets didn't dare to talk nonsense without evidence, countless tabloids didn't have too many scruples. In just a few days, all kinds of messy inside story articles were churned out one after another. Among them, the most widely accepted theory was that a model who had resigned from a big show was pregnant by a media tycoon and had to hide from the public to raise the child. In order to avoid lawsuits, the smart tabloids would definitely not use their real names. However, this kind of obvious hint was probably something that only a fool wouldn't be able to see through. Some of the news that spread through internal channels about Eric flying into a rage because of Heidi Klum's violation of the rules and exiling her overseas had become the fake news that the media and the public snorted in disdain. In the recent days, in the face of the current self-defeating media situation, many people who knew the inside story were gloating at Eric's misfortune. Of course, most of them definitely wouldn't dare to show it in front of Eric, but the relatives and friends around him didn't have such concerns. Even Virginia, who heard the news, teasingly asked if Kevin and Hawaii were going to have a younger brother or sister when Eric returned to East Hampton for the weekend. Compared to the millionaires who were usually middle-aged or even old, Eric, who had accumulated a huge amount of wealth before the age of 30, was really too eye-catching. In addition, due to Eric's profession and his unmarried status, all kinds of gossip surrounding him had never stopped. Therefore, in the face of the hot topic in the outside world, Eric quickly returned to his indifferent attitude. After all, once there were more lice, it wouldn't itch anymore. After Heidi Klum left, while continuing to rehearse the Victoria's Secret show in an orderly manner, Filling in the vacancy became something that Eric had to deal with as soon as possible. The top supermodels in the industry who had originally declined the invitation to the Victoria's Secret show because of various concerns took the initiative to express their desire to join the show after seeing the soaring popularity of the Victoria's Secret Angels and the huge boost to their careers. Those ordinary A-list and B-list supermodels who wanted to make a name for themselves were even more enthusiastic. Countless application letters flew to the Victoria's Secret project team. In a temporary office in the backstage of the munitions factory, Emily said to Eric, who was focused on studying a blueprint of the show, "Naomi Campbell's agent just called. He said that Naomi really wants to join the show and can even walk on the stage for free. However, she wants to at least have a chance to walk the opening and the iconic Victoria's Secret angel wings." Eric shook his head. "The wings can be considered, but the opening is not. Not to mention the opening, there isn't even a closing. All the order of appearance has already been arranged. She can only fill in for Heidi Klum. You can reply to them like this. As for free, there's no need. According to her status, she should pay as much as she should." Emily nodded and took out her phone to dial a number on the spot. If it had been any other normal fashion show, Emily would have definitely persuaded Eric to agree. After all, Naomi Campbell was definitely one of the best in the industry. After inviting her to do a show, everyone would go their separate ways, and there wouldn't be any more entanglements. However, it was different this time. Emily knew very well how bad Naomi Campbell's reputation was in the industry. She threw all kinds of tantrums and even arrived late and left early. The Victoria's Secret show was a whole that required careful planning. The models were not allowed to make any trouble. And Naomi Campbell was undoubtedly the type of person who was most likely to make trouble. After the call, Emily was just about to put her phone away when it rang again. After picking up the call, Emily mumbled a few words, and then hung up with a strange expression. Eric, who had heard some scattered information from Emily's words, raised his head. He knew that this was another direct call to Emily. However, Emily's reaction this time was a little strange. "What's wrong?" Emily shrugged and said, "There's another suitable candidate. I think we can give this one a try." As there was less than a month left before the Victoria's Secret show, there was not much time for the latecomers to train. Therefore, Eric directly rejected the applications of the ordinary A-list and B-list models. From the beginning, he had planned to choose a substitute from the small batch of top supermodels. In the past few days, he had already considered most suitable supermodels. Hearing Emily's words, Eric was curious. "Is there a supermodel that we haven't thought of?" Emily nodded and said, "Stephanie Seymour, what do you think?" Eric was a little surprised. Stephanie Seymour was, of course, one of the top supermodels of this era. Moreover, this supermodel with a strong personality once led a group of ex-girlfriends to sue the lead singer of Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose, for youth loss compensation. This was a valiant act that left a deep impression on Eric. Of course, Eric also thought of Stephanie Seymour, but he dismissed the idea from the beginning. This was because this supermodel with a strong personality had recently hooked up with a big rich guy, the boss of the billion-dollar Brent Publishing Group, Peter Brent. Moreover, the two were already at the stage where they were talking about marriage. Although Peter Brent was more than 20 years older than Stephanie Seymour, Eric still admired this supermodel's skills. After all, most models had a beautiful dream of marrying into a rich family, but there were very few who could really realize their dreams. If I remember correctly, Stephanie Seymour is about to marry Peter Brent. Will Peter Brent be willing to continue participating in business activities with his fiancée? Emily knew a little more than Eric. She said, "Stephanie Seymour has been entangled with Peter Brent for a few years. She has always wanted to get married, but Peter Brent has always been unwilling." After they finally agreed, the two had a disagreement on the prenuptial agreement. Peter Brent was already the father of 5 children, and Stephanie Seymour probably wanted to inherit more money in the future, or get more compensation in case of divorce. "Since I received this call, I think this matter should have come to a conclusion." Eric couldn't help but shake his head. It's like a business negotiation. What's the point of a marriage like this? Emily, who was used to Western thinking and was used to this kind of thing, just rolled her eyes at Eric. If you get married in the future, are you willing to hold a wedding without signing any prenuptial agreement? Eric was suddenly speechless. He muttered, "This seems to be two different things, right?" "Of course it's the same thing." Emily curled her lips and said, "You men can't be the only ones to protect your property. We women can't fight for more benefits for ourselves, right?" Eric always found it difficult to resist Emily's sharp tongue. He spread his hands and said, "Well, let's not talk about this. Let's talk about Stephanie Seymour. Did she have a falling out with Peter Brent?" "Of course not. Stephanie Seymour's agent just told me that the two of them have already agreed on a prenuptial agreement. But I think Stephanie Seymour was not satisfied with the conditions offered by Peter Brent, so she kept the clause to continue her personal business." "This is really..." Eric was a little speechless. Then he said, "Call her and let her try. If it works, she'll be the one." As one of the best supermodels of this era, Stephanie Seymour easily got the vacant seat. The announcement of the news once again caused a small stir. Similar to Eric's thoughts, many people guessed that Stephanie Seymour and the billionaire Peter Brent had broken up. But then, Stephanie Seymour and Peter Brent announced their wedding date in a high-profile manner. When asked if he supported his fiancée to continue her career, Peter Brent, the publishing tycoon, nodded graciously and said that he would personally attend the Victoria's Secret show. Filling the vacancy caused by Heidi Klum's sudden departure, the rehearsals for the Victoria's Secret show entered the final stage. Several singers carefully selected by Firefly Records gradually joined the rehearsals. The show was expected to be held in early November after Halloween, and the official television broadcast was confirmed to be in early December. And with the last episode of the first season of Survivor as a lead-in, there were only 13 episodes in every season of Survivor. Because the first and second episodes were broadcasted simultaneously, the last episode would be broadcasted just before the December winter break. After ABC TV's Survivor's viewership ratings became a hit, it maintained a high viewership rating for the next few weeks, breaking 30 million viewers. However, Eric knew that this was far from the limit of Survivor. In his memory, the first season of Survivor that CBS TV launched had a viewership rating of 50 million at the end. With such a show as a lead-in, Eric believed that the Victoria's Secret show's viewership rating would not be lower than 20 million. It should be known that in his previous life, the highest viewership rating of Friends was not the 52 million for the finale. It was the episode after the Super Bowl final was used as a lead-in. The Super Bowl had a very stable viewership rating of more than 100 million people. With the lead-in of the Super Bowl final, the viewership of Friends had reached 54 million. With the popularity of the Victoria's Secret show, the ordinary audience could only silently wait for the arrival of December to see the true face of this super show that had been hyped by the media for more than half a year. However, for some people, they were able to watch the show live in advance in November. As the date of the Victoria's Secret show approached, the news about the invitation to the Victoria's Secret show was hyped up again. In the original space-time, the highest price for an invitation to the Victoria's Secret show was €10,000, and the subsequent parties were even more expensive. However, Eric did not intend to sell the invitation to the public this time. P.S. Many Westerners' prenuptial agreements were as strict as business contracts. In Hollywood, Spielberg paid his ex-wife $100 million for his first marriage, but the prenuptial agreement for his second marriage stated that if he divorced again, he could only compensate his wife $5 million. Pitt and Julie had been together for almost 10 years, and when they finally got married, the prenuptial agreement was also dozens of pages long. It was said that Tom Cruise's prenuptial agreement was even more bizarre. You can search for it, but you won't know if it's true. In Hollywood, marriage was relatively simple. Although he had married and divorced many times, no matter how long he had been married, he was very honest and gave half of his assets to his ex-wife. Therefore, it was said that he was the most popular ex-wife in Hollywood. Star. Chapter 667. Under normal circumstances, the invitations to the top shows of the 4 major international fashion weeks would not be sold to the public. Of course, there would occasionally be brands that would auction off some of the important seats in the front row in the name of charity. As for whether the money was actually used for charity, no one knew. The reason the invitations were not sold publicly was that the number of guests invited by these top shows was limited. At most, there would be 100 or 200 guests, and at least a few dozen guests. On the other hand, it was to maintain the high-end style, and not just anyone could sneak in. However, the Victoria's Secret show this time was completely different. The Lexington Avenue Munitions Factory, which could originally accommodate 5,000 people, could still accommodate 1,000 guests after the Victoria's Secret project team's modification. The project team held several meetings to discuss how to distribute the 1,000 invitations. The special guests that had been confirmed for the show included celebrities, media people, critics, business partners, and so on, but there were less than 200 people altogether. In the end, there were more than 800 invitations left. Although Victoria's Secret was only a mid-range lingerie brand, after a few months of hype, with the current popularity of the Victoria's Secret show, even if they used the strategy of selling the invitations at a high price of $10,000 like in his previous life, they would definitely be sold out. There was no shortage of high-end consumers in this world. However, in that case, even if it was in the name of charity according to industry practice, they would definitely be ridiculed by the media for being crazy about money. In the end, the project team decided to accept public applications on Yahoo and select suitable guests to distribute the invitations. However, the premise was that the guests who received the invitations had to donate at least $1,000 to the charity designated by the Victoria's Secret brand. The Victoria's Secret project team would not directly handle the donations, so they could avoid criticism for making money. In Western society, except for a few outliers, most companies and celebrities were very careful and had to pay attention to their own public image. This was also the reason why countless charities had appeared. Although the Victoria's Secret project team only set a minimum donation of $1,000 and would not disclose the donation amount of any guests, they also added an additional condition. The 100 guests who donated the most would be directly invited to the Victoria's Secret show after party. From late September to the end of October, the project team had been in New York for more than a month. Under the skillful media manipulation of the marketing team organized by Eric, the continuous news surrounding the Victoria's Secret show pushed the topic of the fashion show to the peak. Throughout October, with the strong advertising effect of the Victoria's Secret fashion show, the sales of the hundreds of Victoria's Secret stores in North America increased by 100%. Last year, the entire Ltd Group's sales revenue was only about $1.5 billion, of which the Victoria's Secret brand's sales were about $1 billion. However, since the first half of this year, the sales of the Victoria's Secret brand had steadily increased due to the advertising effect of the Victoria's Secret show. The sales of the Victoria's Secret brand had exceeded $1 billion in the first 3 quarters, an increase of more than 30% compared to the same period last year. It was estimated that in the last quarter of the Victoria's Secret show, the annual sales of the Ltd Group's Victoria's Secret brand alone would exceed $1.5 billion in revenue last year. At the same time, the marketing model of cooperation with Yahoo's portal over the past few months had also steadily increased the daily traffic of Yahoo's portal. As 1995 approached, in order to prepare for the IPO, Yahoo gradually began to disclose the company's various operating data to the outside world. Although this rapidly rising high-tech company had already attracted a lot of attention, when the detailed number of Yahoo's users was disclosed, it still shocked the entire industry. Although the entire internet industry had begun to emerge, and in addition to Yahoo's portal, similar websites had begun to appear in the industry, but Yahoo was the only one with tens of millions of users. This kind of vague industry oligarchy made most investment banks envious of Yahoo's IPO dealership. Morgan Stanley, who had taken the initiative to contact Eric in an attempt to represent Yahoo's IPO, boldly offered a valuation of $5 billion, which was more than 5 times the price that Bill Gates offered when he tried to acquire Yahoo in the first half of the year. Back in New York, since mid-October, the rehearsals for the Victoria's Secret show had suddenly become tense. In the face of the first large-scale fashion show of such a large scale, although the early preparations were sufficient, all kinds of small problems still came one after another during the rehearsals. In the face of such a situation, no one would be in a good mood. Although Eric tried his best to endure it, on average he would lose his temper several times a day. In private, the Victoria's Secret Angels gradually formed a very unified name for Eric: Tyrant. An angel even inadvertently shouted it in front of Eric. In the face of the girl who realized her mistake and turned pale with fright, Eric could only twitch the corner of his mouth in the end. On October 31st, the traditional Western Halloween, the Victoria's Secret annual show held its final rehearsal in the Arsenal factory on Lexington Avenue. 40 Victoria's Secret Angels live performers and 120 behind-the-scenes coordinators, photographers and makeup teams were all present. There were also a few guests in the audience. As the British Honor Guard in red tuxedos beat the first drum beat, the entire Arsenal factory in front of and behind the scenes moved. The busy backstage, nervous models, gorgeous stage, and all the other scenes were displayed on the 8 surveillance screens in the central control room. Eric had a few walkie-talkies beside him. His eyes were fixed on the screens, and from time to time he would pick up a walkie-talkie and say a few words loudly. The final Victoria's Secret show would be edited into a standard 43-minute broadcast format, but in fact, the complete 6 performances and the changing of the scenery in the middle totaled more than an hour. When all the processes were finally completed, Eric was finally relieved. Picking up the walkie-talkie to inform the executive director to gather everyone in the stands, Eric wiped the fine beads of sweat on his forehead, walked into the bathroom to wash his face, and then walked to the front stage. At this time, the Victoria's Secret stage had undergone a drastic change compared to when he first arrived. The entrance was a huge hard projector screen, and the tall arch was embellished with various eye-catching lights. The catwalk was sprinkled with dazzling silver sequins, like a gorgeous carpet covered with diamonds. The exquisitely arranged lights clearly separated the catwalk from the stands. Eric walked out of the arch from backstage and looked around. After thinking for a moment, he could not think of anything that needed to be improved during the rehearsal, so he looked at the staff gathered in the stands. Surrounded by hundreds of people, the Victoria's Secret Angels in pink silk pajamas looked a little nervous. Many of them seemed to be recalling if they had made any mistakes just now. Eric originally wanted to jump off the catwalk, but after he stretched out his leg, he simply sat down on the catwalk. Looking at the hundreds of people in front of him who were quietly waiting for him to speak, he smiled and said, "Today is Halloween. Have you thought about what you're going to dress up as tonight?" Many people looked at each other at Eric's somewhat abrupt reaction, but there were also some who chuckled cooperatively. Eric pointed at Diane Kruger, who was right in front of him. "Diane, do you have any plans?" Diane Kruger did not expect Eric to suddenly point at her. She was a little flustered and stammered, "I am going back to sleep." "Haha." There was a burst of laughter in the venue. Eric also smiled and nodded. This is also a choice. After being busy for a few months, everyone must be very tired. Moreover, they have to face a tyrant, who can go crazy at any time. If it were me, I would also choose to have a good sleep after everything is over. Amidst another chuckle, Eric continued, "However, I think all of you must have felt the changes that have happened to you recently. Diane, what endorsement offers have you received recently?" Diane Kruger was a little embarrassed that Eric kept pointing at her to speak. She knew very well that she was not favored by the project team during the Victoria's Secret Angel selection. It was Eric who personally selected her and made her one of the 5 spokespersons for Victoria's Secret. Originally, she thought that Eric had some special thoughts about her, and she was also looking forward to Eric taking the initiative to ask to go on a date with her. However, a few months had passed, and none of the things she expected had happened. However, Eric's somewhat special attitude toward her did not change much. Although the 40 Victoria's Secret Angels were as close as sisters on the surface, she knew very well that in private, almost all of them were jealous of Eric's special care for her. There were even some rumors about her and Eric. Although her mind was in a mess, Diane Kruger did not dare to ignore Eric's question. However, she had received too many endorsement offers recently. Even she was not too sure about them. Most of them were handled by her agent. After thinking about it, she carefully answered, I think there are Chanel, Armani, Dior." As Diane Kruger spoke, She could even feel the jealous gazes on her body. She suddenly stopped. Everyone present knew each other very well, and Diane Kruger was undoubtedly the luckiest one to reach the top in a single bound. Before joining the Victoria's Secret fashion show, Diane Kruger did not even have a single endorsement offer for an ordinary first-tier brand, let alone Chanel and Armani. Most of the time, she was just like many other ordinary models, shooting TV or print ads and participating in some fashion shows. Seeing that Diane Kruger had suddenly stopped, Eric did not pursue the matter. He looked at everyone and said, "I think everyone has more or less received some brand collaboration offers. Perhaps you occasionally feel that it is not enough to share the influence of this show with 40 people. However, I can say with certainty that you are definitely the luckiest 40 models out of hundreds of thousands of models in the world. Although spending a few months on this Victoria's Secret fashion show will reduce your income this year, I believe that by next year, your income will definitely increase exponentially. Moreover, the most important point is that your professional lifespan will be extended by many years with the influence of the Victoria's Secret fashion show. Of course, the premise is that you continue to be interested in collaborating with Victoria's Secret next year." Noticing that the Victoria's Secret angel sitting in the front row trembled when she heard Eric's last sentence, Eric could not help but laugh. Looking at the face that somewhat resembled Audrey Hepburn, he said with a smile, "Paulina, don't be so nervous. I can tell you now that I will definitely not personally direct the Victoria's Secret fashion show next year. After this year's accumulation of experience, next year's preparation time will not take as long as this year's. Therefore, you will receive a more generous salary next year, but at the same time, your work will become easier." The Victoria's Secret angel named Paulina gave Eric a charming smile and said, "Mr. Williams, I will definitely be back next year." Eric smiled and changed his posture slightly. He clapped his hands and said, "Then now let's talk about the dress rehearsal just now. I am very satisfied with everyone's final performance. As long as everyone still shows today's standard in 2 days, I am sure that we will definitely amaze the whole world." Amidst the excited cheers and applause, Eric pressed his hands together and said to everyone, "Tomorrow, everyone will take a day off. Of course, tonight is Halloween. Although you are not prohibited from participating in all kinds of parties, I still hope that everyone can go back and have a good rest, as Diane just said. I don't want any accidents to happen to any of you in the last 2 days. Now everyone is dismissed." After finishing his words, Eric stood up on the edge of the tea stage and walked backstage. Most of the people present waited for Eric's figure to disappear behind the arch before they excitedly whispered and walked out. Emily, Edward Lazek, and Eric's assistant Kelly were just quietly listening to Eric's speech behind the arch. Now they all came up to him. "Eric, do you think there is anything else that needs to be adjusted?" Emily had just been making arrangements on the spot, and did not stay in the central control room with Eric. At this time, she could not wait to ask. After seeing the marketing ability of the Victoria's Secret show, Emily now attached much more importance to the Victoria's Secret show than Eric. Eric shook his head and said, "No, all the shooting effects have been tested. I just watched the whole rehearsal and did not find any problems. Moreover, there is nothing 100% perfect in this world. If there is any regret, just keep it. We have to give the media something to talk about in the future." Emily rolled her eyes at Eric and did not mention it anymore. She smiled and said, "What about you now? Are you going to East Hampton to celebrate Halloween with them?" "I just want to go back and sleep now," Eric answered and looked at Kelly beside him. "You go back with me. I have something to discuss with you." Chapter 668. Under everyone's attention, it was finally the 2nd of November. The Victoria's Secret fashion show would start at 7 o'clock in the evening and end at 8:30 if everything went well. The after-party would be held at the Gramercy Hotel, not far from the munitions factory. Since early morning, the media reporters stationed in New York began to gather near the munitions factory on Lexington Avenue. Just after noon, the roads within a few hundred meters of the munitions factory were packed with media from all over the world. After Firefly communicated with the New York Municipal Transportation Department, the The roads between 2 blocks around the munitions factory were blocked early in the morning of November 2nd. Fortunately, the munitions factory was located at the southern end of Lexington Avenue, which was not a busy area in New York. The road blockage would not have serious consequences for the nearby public transportation. Therefore, the Municipal Transportation Department readily approved Firefly's request. The entire project team entered the munitions factory early in the morning of November 2nd to make the final preparations. Under the tight security, even the invited media had to wait until it was time to enter before they were allowed to enter. Most of the uninvited reporters could only wait patiently outside the munitions factory, hoping to get some useful information. Although the guests would enter at 6 o'clock in the evening, there was always a shortage of people in the world who wanted to get attention for various reasons. The place where hundreds of media reporters gathered was undoubtedly the focus of these people. Some of the reporters who had occupied good shooting positions since the early morning and had been waiting outside the munitions factory thought that they would not get any useful news until the afternoon. However, they had obviously underestimated the influence of this fashion show and the determination of some people to become famous. Throughout the day, there were all kinds of people trying to gain fame on the streets near the munitions factory. Of course, most of them were models. After all, there were only 40 lucky people in the Victoria's Secret fashion show. As a fashion capital, there were countless beautiful girls gathered here. Feeling the influence of the Victoria's Secret fashion show, these models, who had no chance to be on the Victoria's Secret fashion show, found another way. Some of the more capable models often led a small team to take various photos on the streets near the munitions factory, so that they could publish news such as XXX attends the Victoria's Secret show the next day. Even if they didn't have the opportunity to step into the munitions factory, no one would pursue this little trick of gaining fame. Young models without the ability could only dress themselves up, walk up and down the street, or pretend to wait for friends under the street lights for a few hours. Although most of the photos would be discarded by the reporters, as long as a few of them appeared in the newspapers and magazines, it was an opportunity for these girls. If they could attract the attention of some fashion tycoons, they could reach the sky in one step. This kind of thing was not unprecedented. Back then, Cindy Crawford relied on a few street photos taken by tabloid reporters to attract the attention of the fashion industry. And step by step, she reached her current position. In the face of these young models who gained fame, the reporters gathered near the munitions factory often maintained a proud posture of knowing the inside story. Occasionally, they would press the shutter a few times, as if they were bestowing a gift or slightly adjusting the shutter. But as dusk approached, they looked enviously at some of their peers who were arranged to enter the munitions factory in advance. All the media people were on high alert as they waited for the arrival of 6 o'clock. These people knew very well that with Eric's current status, even if he sent an invitation to the federal president, the Clintons probably wouldn't refuse the fashion show that he had personally produced. Although the Victoria's Secret project team did not announce any guest list to the public, the lineup of guests who would attend the Victoria's Secret show today was definitely very powerful. However, just as the hour hand moved to 5:40, an arrogant white limousine appeared at the end of the red carpet outside the munitions factory. The Westerners' concept of time was almost deeply ingrained. This somewhat abrupt move surprised everyone, but the flashes still went off like crazy. After the limousine driver got off, he respectfully opened the door. A baby-faced girl in a short pink trench coat couldn't wait to jump out of the car. "It's so lively," the little girl said to herself with a smile. Then she waved to the nearest group of reporters. "Hi everyone." Seeing the appearance of Drew, who had an unusually close relationship with Eric, the group of reporters boiled over. When they heard the little girl's greeting, there was suddenly a mess of responses. Someone asked loudly, "Miss Barrymore, are you here to cheer for Mr. Williams?" The little girl smiled and nodded. "Yes." Amidst the noise, a very bold reporter raised his voice and asked, "Miss Barrymore, what do you think of the scandal between Mr. Williams and Heidi Crumb?" The little girl's smile remained unchanged. "The things you wrote are quite fun. I don't have any opinions. As long as everyone is happy." This slightly sarcastic remark made some of the reporters a little embarrassed. Some people noticed that the little girl was standing at the end of the red carpet, and didn't seem to be in a hurry to move forward. Puzzled, they were about to ask when the limousine door opened again, and gave them the answer. The rear door of the limousine opened, and two beautiful blonde Russian girls with the same height and appearance walked out of the car. The twins were wearing the same dark-colored trench coat and black boots. Under their beautiful appearance, there was a heroic aura that was almost similar to that of a soldier. Although the little girl was still playful in recent years, she kept a low profile and almost never appeared in the media. Suddenly, she appeared in front of the reporters with the Russian twins, which immediately caused a slight uproar. "Miss Barrymore, may I ask who these two beautiful ladies are? Are they also models?" The little girl casually put her small hands in her pockets and walked leisurely on the red carpet toward the entrance of the munitions factory. She replied, "They are Natasha, not models. They are my bodyguards." Although they noticed the slightly cold aura exuding from the Russian twins, the two identical delicate faces made it difficult for them to believe the twins' profession. "Miss Barrymore, you must be joking. Or are they going to play the role of bodyguards in a movie of the Firefly Group? Hee, your idea is very interesting. If there is a chance, I will let them try it out." With that said, the little girl walked to the entrance of the munitions factory with the twins. The tall guard waited for Drew to come closer, and without any intention of letting the little girl show her invitation, he took the initiative to open the anti-collision chain and respectfully let the little girl and the twins in. This action immediately caused some dissatisfaction. "Hey, big guy, don't tell me Drew Barrymore doesn't need an invitation?" a reporter asked in a questioning tone. However, the only thing that the person who asked the question received was a roll of the eyes. The little girl walked into the outer hall of the munitions factory, picked up a pen, and casually drew a few lines in front of the photo-taking wall. Some special reporters who were not ready to take pictures were surprised and left in a flash. Walking in the corridor leading to the backstage, the little girl looked at the surrounding decorations with great interest. Suddenly, she asked the twins behind her, "Natasha, how did it feel to be the center of attention just now?" The twins looked at each other, and one of them said, "Boss, it felt very awkward." "Hee, that's right. Just don't fall in love with this feeling. Otherwise, you will be very distressed." The twins nodded at the same time and quietly followed behind Drew. They both knew why Drew said that. Because even if they fell in love with this feeling, this seemingly harmless boss would not give them too many opportunities to enjoy this feeling. The trajectory of their fate had already been determined. With this thought in mind, the figure of the young man they were about to see appeared in the twins' minds at the same time. He liked to let them call him master. Although they knew that there was a hidden meaning behind it, they could not resist it too much. Instead, they were more in awe of him. This was because they knew that although the young man was young, he was a very, very powerful person. The wealth he had was even more than the money in the treasury of the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Although this wealth had nothing to do with them, it gave them an unprecedented sense of security. After the little girl appeared, it was soon 6 o'clock. Limousines began to park outside the red carpet, which was not too long. The group of reporters surrounding the red carpet began to frantically press their shutters. New York's political and business celebrities, fashion tycoons, media executives, Hollywood superstars, and other key figures who rarely gathered together were all in the reporters' sights. Although Eric did not have any intention of letting these guests steal too much of the limelight from the Victoria's Secret Angel, he did not refuse these people who took the initiative to come and support him. It was undeniable that the influence brought by the appearance of these big shots would definitely cause the media to fiercely discuss for a while. The topic of the Victoria's Secret fashion show would be maintained until the official broadcast in December. Time passed by minute. The special guests could still walk the red carpet, but most of the ordinary guests could only enter the munitions factory through other channels. Otherwise, it would be impossible for the 1,000 guests to all enter within an hour. As it approached 7 o'clock, Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of the American version of Vogue, sat in the front row on the left side of the runway and chatted in a low voice with Jane Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone, next to her. However, her eyes were looking at the luxurious lineup of guests around her and the professional and gorgeous decorations in the venue. She could not help but feel a little emotional. Ever since she became the editor-in-chief of Vogue, no matter which fashion brand it was, as long as she appeared in the show, she would definitely be the most eye-catching big shot in the venue. Before those big shows, the main people in charge and designers would take the initiative to come out and greet her. But today, for the first time, Anna Wintour felt the long-lost feeling of being ignored. However, she did not feel angry or depressed because many people around her were far more famous and had a higher status than her. Not to mention the tycoons of other industries. Just not far from her was the big boss of Vogue's parent company, Condé Nast Group, She Newhouse. Anna Wintour, who used to be greeted by others, had just walked over to greet him. It was finally 7 o'clock. With a few light clicks, the lights in the hall changed rapidly. The VIP seats became dim, and the tea stage covered with silver sequins became even brighter. Everyone's eyes turned to the huge arched door. In front of the hard projection screen behind the arch, special rock instruments had been installed. Anna Wintour could not help but think of some rumors. She had some doubts and expectations in her heart. Was Eric Williams going to perform on stage in person? However, she quickly threw this idea away. It was reasonable for Eric to direct a fashion show in person. If he were to perform on stage in person with his current status, it would be a bit out of line. Anna Wintour thought and whispered to Jane Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone, next to her. Jane, have you heard which bands will perform on stage this time? Jane Wenner shook his head. I don't know. Some news we received is that Firefly Group will launch some of its own singers. Jeffrey Katzenberg reorganized all the music departments of Firefly's subsidiary company some time ago and created Firefly Records. However, judging from the scandal some time ago, everyone knows that all the BGM of this big show was written by Eric Williams himself. His song New Divide, a few years ago, was simply amazing. I guess this song will never disappoint. I am very much looking forward to it. Anna Wintour nodded. She was not very interested in music. Instead, she was looking forward to what kind of interior show Eric would come up with this time. After the lights came on, Eric quickly came out and gave a short speech in person. Then he left in the applause. The lights in the venue changed again. The bright red light dyed the whole runway red. The whole venue seemed to be dyed a bright red. The crisp sound of drums rang out, and the British Guard of Honor walked out under the red lights and began to perform. Some people in the venue still maintained a strong curiosity, while others were already a little indifferent. What was the meaning of this? However, the sound that followed soon answered their doubts. When the drums became more and more rapid and left the runway, the announcer announced the first theme of the Victoria's Secret show, British Invasion. A few unfamiliar rock and roll young people walked on stage. The explosive music suddenly rang out. P.S. You can watch the 2013 Victoria's Secret annual show. The following scenes are mainly based on this episode. However, the main highlight of this episode is only the music. Most of the angels are average. If you want to see models and catwalks, look for the 2006 show. Giselle's opening was very domineering. Chapter 669. The deafening surround sound system also resounded throughout the backstage of the munitions factory. The punk rock music was inspiring, but it also brought a strong sense of tension to all the Victoria's Secret angels. As long as they successfully completed tonight's show, they would usher in a new world in their career. However, if anything went wrong, it could also bring about a devastating blow to their career. As the opening Victoria's Secret angel, Diane Kruger even felt her hands and feet slightly numb. She pursed her pink thin lips and quickly drew a cross in front of her. Then, she took a deep breath and tried to relax herself as much as possible. Everyone go. Under the command of the executive director in the headset, the staff waiting next to Diane Kruger gently pushed the girl out of the venue and quickly turned their attention to the next Victoria's Secret angel. After a long period of strict rehearsal, Diane Kruger, who was slightly dizzy, almost instinctively walked to the stage. Her exquisitely made-up face revealed a charming smile that she had secretly practiced countless times. Under the warm atmosphere, with her appearance, there was a burst of applause and cheers almost without any signal. After a short pause at the exit, Diane Kruger walked to the shining silver runway with a strong personal style that had undergone the hellish training arranged by Eric. Among the 5 spokespersons of Victoria's Secret, Diane Kruger was the least famous one. Or rather, she was not famous at all before this. Therefore, since the announcement of the list, the industry had always maintained a strong interest in this petite and slightly immature girl who had just turned 18 years old. Almost everyone was sure that this girl who suddenly rose to fame had some kind of relationship with Eric. However, at this time, many people present still did not expect that Eric would let this unknown girl walk the opening. Most people thought that the opening supermodels of the Victoria's Secret fashion show would definitely only be chosen between the 3 top supermodels, Christy Doington, Linda Evangelista, and Cindy Crawford. When they saw Diane Kruger appear on the stage first, many people had the same thought in their minds. This was too much of a favor. While some of the invited media personnel were already thinking about how to subtly satirize this matter, Diane Kruger's very obvious personal style of walking on the stage amazed many people. This was a kind of confident and domineering style of walking on the stage, with a steady but slightly seductive gait, almost unforgettable. It was a little unbelievable. Only people in the fashion industry knew how rare it was to have a model with a unique personal style of walking. Take Naomi Campbell for example. If it were not for her queen-like walk that made too many designers unable to stop, with her terrible personality, she would have been banned by the entire fashion industry. Many fashion tycoons who were invited here were even secretly confused. If such an excellent girl appeared on the T stage before, she should have already stood out. There was no reason for her to be discovered by Eric Williams until now. Although they were puzzled, many people began to secretly make up their minds to invite Diane Kruger to work with them. While some people were paying attention to Diane Kruger's stunning walk on the runway, many people were also paying attention to Diane Kruger's angelic outfit. It was a British-style military uniform with a red jacket, black wings, white gloves, and a simple innerwear. The girl looked sexy and playful, especially when she made a playful military salute at the end of the runway, which made most people in the venue cheer again. Of course, some people appreciated it, some people cheered, and some people expressed disdain. Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of Vogue, who was sitting in the front row of the show, heard a woman comment behind her with some sarcasm. "So this is the angelic outfit that Eric Williams has been hyping for months. Does he really think that those with wings are angels?" Anna Wintour remembered that this woman's voice should be from the editor-in-chief of Metropolis magazine. She just smiled coldly at the woman's frivolous comment. There was only one basic purpose of any fashion show, and that was to publicize it. Many fashion shows on high streets that seemed to be shrouded in fog were not targeted at ordinary people at all. They were targeted at those knowledgeable fashion media, shopping malls, and other groups. Even most of the celebrities who were invited to support the show were just putting on an act. In fact, they did not understand it at all. Those exaggerated fashions only showed the design concept of a brand for the next season. Anna Wintour, who was used to those fashion shows on high streets, felt a moment of discomfort when she saw Diane Kruger's angelic outfit. This style of angelic outfit seemed to be too down-to-earth. However, Anna Wintour quickly realized that the real audience of this Victoria's Secret show was the ordinary TV audience. If Eric Williams dared to design a series of exaggerated outfits for the Victoria's Secret angels like those traditional fashion shows, it would definitely cause a lot of criticism from the ordinary audience when it was broadcasted in the future. The angelic outfit design that perfectly displayed the sexy figures of the Victoria's Secret angels and was very pleasing to the eye was the most approachable style. Most of the attention was firmly attracted by the gorgeous angelic outfits and the sexy figures of the Victoria's Secret angels. Sitting next to Anna Wintour, the founder of Rolling Stone, Jane Wenner, was firmly locked on the attention of several rock and roll youths on the stage. The arrogant punk rock style of "My Songs Know What You Did in the Dark" made Jane Wenner, whose love for music had been dormant for many years, feel his blood boil again. He seemed to think of many years ago. It was because of his fanatical love for the world-famous rock band The Beatles that he and a group of friends founded the now famous Rolling Stone magazine in the attic of a dilapidated printing plant. More than 20 years later, Rolling Stone magazine was no longer the pamphlet of fanzine it used to be. It had developed into a comprehensive media magazine covering many fields such as film, television, music, and so on. Jane Wenner had also changed from a hot-blooded youth to a rich publisher. When Cindy Crawford, who had closed the show, stepped backstage and the music finally stopped, Jane Wenner, who still wanted to continue, found himself unconsciously standing up. After realizing this, Jane Wenner suddenly looked around awkwardly. However, he soon found that many people around him had involuntarily stood up and applauded enthusiastically. After the first theme ended, the arch at the exit dimmed. Some figures began to nervously arrange various props, and the venue was filled with soft, soothing music. However, no matter which aspect of the show they focused on, everyone in the venue had strong expectations for the next theme. Amidst this kind of anticipation, the two major themes, Demon in the Dark and Pink Lady, which were released consecutively, once again brought a rich visual and auditory feast to the audience. Most of the audience felt that compared to participating in those high-street fashion shows that were just for style, this was the real enjoyment. At the same time, most people also noticed the three new songs with completely different styles that were released consecutively for the three themes. After the first punk rock song, Foo, the background music of Demon in the Dark was so imposing that it even caused the young women present to scream. When some people thought that the song seemed to be too rebellious, the third song, Stronger, was released immediately to make up for the regret in it. The two songs were simply echoing each other. The former described a girl with a strong personality who strongly criticized her unfaithful boyfriend, while the latter was almost the same girl talking about how the breakup not only did not hurt her, but also made her stronger. After these two themes, Anna Wintour couldn't help but say to Jane Wenner next to her, "If it weren't for the fact that Eric Williams has so many scandals, maybe he really is a feminist." Jane Wenner just smiled slightly. Although the two songs that followed were still amazing, Jane Wenner was still looking forward to the rock band coming on stage again. So in this kind of anticipation, the rock band came on stage again. However, when the majestic prelude of the Phoenix sounded, some people in the venue who were more familiar with symphonies couldn't help but open their mouths in surprise. Because they all heard that the rock accompaniment this time used the rhythm of many well-known composers of the former Soviet Union, Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7. Perhaps not many people have heard of Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7 in C major, but this symphony has another name, Leningrad Symphony. This majestic symphony was produced during the tragic defense of Leningrad during World War II. It was a complete war symphony. Music knows no borders, not to mention now that the once powerful Soviet Union has been reduced to ashes, so no one cared that Eric used Leningrad Symphony as the accompaniment. The audience in the venue became even more fanatical in the shocking music. After the theme ended, Jane Wenner, who sat down with everyone, couldn't help but sigh. Eric Williams is really a fucking genius. Anna Wintour didn't mind Jane Wenner's gaffe. She smiled and said, "Have you started to think of a special report for this show?" Jane Wenner nodded immediately. Not only that, he even planned to write the special report himself. However, after having this idea, Jane Wenner was immediately stunned. Anna Wintour asked, "What's wrong, Jane?" Jane Wenner shook his head and said, "Anna, we don't seem to know anything about these singers and the names of the new songs. If that's the case, how can we write the special report?" Anna Wintour thought for a moment, then realized something and said, "I understand." "What?" Jane Wenner asked eagerly. Anna Wintour said, "The purpose of this Victoria's Secret show is still to promote the brand. Although these songs are all composed by Eric Williams himself, he definitely doesn't want the media to pay too much attention to these new songs." Jane Wenner also showed a look of regret. "So we don't know anything about these bands, singers, and the names of the songs. It's not easy to start a discussion on this. This move is really amazing. No wonder I didn't hear any introduction of these singers and music from the beginning to the end." Anna Wintour nodded. Eric Williams' marketing of Victoria's Secret this time is a classic. I even think that this case study will be included in many business school textbooks. So he definitely won't let go of this marketing point of music. Maybe he's just waiting for the right time. As the two of them chatted in a low voice, the lights in the hall changed again. The original strong lights went out one after another, and specks of golden light lit up. The atmosphere in the hall became somewhat illusory, luxurious, and mysterious. It reminded people of those extravagant jazz parties in the United States in the 1920s. The classical and soothing prelude of Young and Beautiful gradually sounded with a sigh of a woman's humming. Cindy Crawford, who already had a bit of a classical beauty, appeared on the runway wearing the iconic pearl accessories of the golden era, a small round hat, and a crystal dress, creating a dreamlike scene of the past, making people feel as if they had returned to the past. Some of the older audience members in the venue didn't really like the slightly noisy music, but when this soothing Baroque tune slowly sounded, many of the older audience members couldn't help but reminisce about the past and feel a sense of loss. They were already middle-aged. They had already achieved success and had seen all the prosperity. However, the girl who had walked through the streets and alleys hand in hand with them back then had disappeared without a trace. Although this kind of regret was not heart-wrenching, it was always difficult to let go of. Thus, unknowingly, tears fell. After one song, facing the empty stage, the audience, who didn't pay much attention to the singer, suddenly had the desire to see the singer. However, they didn't know what the project team was thinking. Every time the male rock band went on stage, the singers of the female songs didn't appear. They only used the accompaniment mode. In the central control room backstage of the show, Eric looked at the image on the monitor in front of him and nodded with satisfaction. Regarding the doubts of many people in the venue, Eric, of course, wasn't completely out of personal preference. Based on some experience in his previous life, in many of the annual Victoria's Secret shows, the female guests only had two effects when they appeared on stage. Either the female guests stole the limelight from the angels and were ridiculed as a special concert, or the angels of Victoria's Secret made the guests, who were usually relatively short, look like ugly ducklings. No matter which one it was, the effect was very bad, so Eric simply didn't let the female singer go on stage. Looking at the people nervously preparing for the last theme on the monitor, Eric picked up the only walkie-talkie on the console that could connect everyone's earphones and said a few words of encouragement in a warm tone. After putting down the walkie-talkie, he looked at Xiaomi and the twins in the central control room with him and said with a smile, "It's the last theme. Don't you want to go out and take a look?" Xiaomi, who was flipping through Eric's thick workbook, raised her small chin and said with a smile, "No, I prefer to see you." Eric shrugged helplessly and didn't say anything more. As the executive director's voice came out from the walkie-talkie, everyone's attention was once again turned to the monitor screen. As long as there were no mistakes with the theme, this show would be a perfect end. 5 of the 6 themes had already passed, and each of the 5 major spokespersons of Victoria's Secret had gone through an opening. The opening of the last theme, Snowy Fairy, was still handed over to Diane Kruger by Eric. Noticing that the girl on the monitor was once again nervously drawing a cross in front of her, Eric smiled. He was very satisfied with Diane Kruger's performance, and he believed that no one in the venue would question his preference for this girl at this time. The music of the last song, "I Know You Were Trouble," sounded, and Diane Kruger, like a snow fairy, walked to the front of the stage. Eric's gaze followed Diane Kruger's figure and moved to the camera monitor in the venue. In the fixed-point panoramic lens, everything was going smoothly. However, when Diane Kruger walked a quarter of the runway, Eric suddenly felt Diane Kruger's figure shake violently, and a silver high heel detached from her left foot. Star. Chapter 670. The moment her high heel fell off, Diane Kruger's mind buzzed. She felt as if she had been sucked out of her body, and the sudden feeling of emptiness almost made her collapse on the runway. "I screwed up? I screwed up. I screwed up. I screwed up. I screwed up." This despairing thought flashed through Diane Kruger's mind countless times. She seemed to hear the mocking laughter of the audience, but no one shouted for her to stop. The lights were still changing, the music was still playing, and the artificial snow was still fluttering in the air. So, after a moment of hesitation, the girl tiptoed with her bare left foot and continued to walk forward. At this time, the months of rigorous training finally had its effect. Although she had lost one of her high heels, Diane Kruger's figure quickly regained its balance, and the confident and unique style of walking on the runway was once again displayed. The moment the high heel fell off, some people in the audience couldn't help but show a gloating expression. When Diane Kruger steadied herself, many people felt a little regretful. Why didn't she fall down? However, when Diane Kruger walked confidently to the end of the runway with steady steps, most people's moods gradually changed. Everyone couldn't help but wonder if they could do better than this girl if they were faced with such an unexpected situation. The answer was definitely no. The strong in adversity could always easily win people's instinctive respect, and the gloating mood was quickly replaced by admiration. So, when Diane Kruger began to turn around, the audience slowly burst into spontaneous applause. This kind of applause reached a climax when Diane Kruger finished her walk, and the warm applause even faintly suppressed the sound of the music in the venue at the last moment. Diane Kruger, who was basically following the professional instincts of her rigorous training, didn't feel the emotional changes of the audience at all. She forced herself to walk to the end of the runway, and just as her figure disappeared into the backstage entrance, making sure that the cameras in the venue couldn't track her, Diane Kruger's last bit of strength suddenly ran out. Tears gushed out of her eyes, and she collapsed weakly on the stairs leading to the backstage. In addition to the central control room where Eric was, there were 3 large screens scattered around the backstage to monitor the situation. When Diane Kruger's high heels fell, the backstage stage controller notified everyone through the walkie-talkie in just a few seconds. Diane Kruger was still on the runway, but there was already a commotion backstage. In the central control room, Eric's heart skipped a beat when he saw Diane Kruger's high heels fall. It was impossible for him not to be angry when something like this happened at the last minute of a perfect show. However, things had already happened, and Eric knew that being angry wouldn't help at all. Then Eric noticed that Diane Kruger had quickly adjusted her state of mind, as well as the changes in the reactions of the audience. Eric's tightly furrowed brows gradually relaxed. He rubbed the walkie-talkie in his hand and thought for a moment. Eric pressed the button to control all the communication channels and said in a decisive tone, "This is Eric Williams. All units, pay attention. Carry on with your duties. Do not panic. Nickel, ask your assistant to send that high heel to me immediately." Putting down the walkie-talkie, Eric glanced at the scenes on the monitor screen that were quickly restored to their original order. After giving a few instructions to a staff member sitting in front of the monitor screen, he quickly walked out of the central control room. As soon as he stepped out of the door, Emily, Edward Lazek, and the others came up to him. Seeing Eric, Emily, who also looked a little upset, couldn't wait to say, "Eric, I just asked Donnie, who is in charge of logistics. If we redo the last theme, the artificial snow definitely won't last for 4 minutes. It will take at least half an hour to reassemble. What should we do?" Recalling the scene he just saw, Eric didn't stop walking and said, "There's no need to redo it. Call Tina over later. We need to have a good talk about this." Emily said in surprise, "What? There's no need to redo it, but..." "Don't worry, Emily. I've already come up with some good ideas." As the few of them were talking, they had already arrived at the entrance that connected to the front desk. The Victoria's Secret angels who had completed their tasks walked back from the front desk from time to time. Almost all of them had a relieved expression on their faces. Diane Kruger was already sitting on the stairs. When she saw Eric, her slender body shivered a little. Her tears that had not stopped in the first place gushed out again. I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. I messed it up. I didn't do it on purpose. I don't know why that high heel. Why did it suddenly fall off?" Eric sighed softly in his heart. Although he had already thought of a solution, this Victoria's Secret fashion show still didn't achieve the perfect effect that he wanted. Seeing that Diane Kruger still had that slightly heavy big wing on her back, Eric gestured to the 2 staff members and said, "Help Diane take the wing off. Also, where's that high heel?" Hearing that Eric was going to take the Victoria's Secret angel wings off her body, Diane Kruger's expression became even sadder. However, she didn't dare to say anything. She had messed up such an important task. Even if there was a reshoot, it definitely wouldn't have anything to do with her. The angel wings were quickly taken off. Without the angel wings as a foil, Diane Kruger's body looked even more delicate. Coupled with her heartbroken expression, anyone couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for her. Nickel, who was personally in charge of the photography at the front desk, quickly asked his assistant to send the high heel over. Eric instructed the staff around him to find a transparent plastic bag and put the high heel in it. Looking at the beautiful girl who was still crying in front of him, Eric walked up the stairs and sat down beside Diane Kruger. He gently reached out and pulled the girl over. Feeling Eric's action, Diane Kruger's body stiffened slightly. However, she quickly leaned over obediently. Leaning on Eric's shoulder, she inexplicably felt a little more at ease in her heart. Gradually, she stopped crying. When the little girl who came with Eric saw this scene, she couldn't help but pout her little mouth. At the same time, the expressions of the people around them were a little strange. However, before they had time to show any flirtatious expressions, they were attracted by Eric's next action. Some people even couldn't help but gasp. This was because Eric was carefully inspecting the high heel through the plastic bag. The last theme was still going on, and the music in the venue was still playing. However, the small area at the entrance of the backstage seemed to have created a silent vacuum with Eric's actions. Why is Eric inspecting that high heel? The sharp-eyed people around them had already noticed that the silver high heel in the transparent plastic bag had a shoelace in front. However, at this time, it had already been broken in two. At the same time, the crowd had the same thought. Someone was jealous of Diane Kruger's special treatment, so they did something to the high heel to embarrass her. This kind of deception was actually very common in the fashion industry. In the circle, there were more than one cases where models pushed each other on the runway and caused each other to fall down. However, the crowd didn't expect that someone would dare to do this at Eric's big show. Most people noticed Eric's dignified expression and were a little quiet. However, Emily didn't have such scruples. She walked forward and took the high heel from Eric's hand. After looking at it carefully, she said with some uncertainty, "Eric, it looks like it broke naturally?" Eric also felt that the break of the shoelace seemed to have broken naturally, but he didn't believe that such a coincidence would happen. This pair of shoes had only been worn a few times during the final dress rehearsals. There were no problems during those times, but now it suddenly broke. This was too much of a coincidence. Looking at the several senior executives of the Victoria's Secret project team, and the staff who were not far away, Eric thought for a moment, and handed the high heel in the plastic bag back to Emily. "Contact the FBI and ask them to help do a trace test on the break of the shoelace to determine if it was an accident. If it was an accident, then forget it. Also, don't forget to ask them to take the fingerprints on this shoe." After thinking about it, Eric took off Diane Kruger's other shoe, put it in a plastic bag, and handed it to Emily. "And this one, see if anyone did anything to it." "I'll do it now. I'll try to get the results out tomorrow." Emily put away the high heel with a solemn expression and said, "I won't be participating in the rest of the party. You can help to host it." The group of people looked at Emily nervously as she hurried away with the pair of high heels. There was a feeling of a storm in their hearts. Eric just said that if it was an accident, then forget it. He didn't mention what to do if it wasn't an accident. However, they all knew very well that if someone did something behind the scenes, then Eric would never let it go. After Emily left, Eric waved to the people around him. "The last theme is coming to an end. Everyone, go prepare for the curtain call. There's no need to gather here." Everyone returned to their positions. Eric then looked at Diane Kruger, who was still leaning on him. "Can you still go on stage? You performed so well today. If you don't appear during the curtain call, then it'll be a pity." Although Diane Kruger had already realized that the incident on the runway just now was not her fault, the feeling of exhaustion after the strong stimulation was not so easy to recover from. After taking a few deep breaths, the girl still felt weak in her hands and feet. She had no strength at all to get up. Eric patted her shoulder comfortingly and said to Edward Razek, "Edward, let the rock band perform another song later. Postpone the curtain call for 5 minutes." Edward nodded, picked up the walkie-talkie, said a few words, and walked to the stage. Eric looked at Diane Kruger next to him and asked, "There are still 5 minutes left. Do you want to eat something? Maybe you'll feel better?" "Okay." Diane Kruger nodded weakly. She did not expect Eric to postpone the closing of the show for her. She could not help but blush. Eric looked up at the twins next to the girl. "Natasha, Come and help Diane to the resting area." The twins were just about to move, but Drew reached out and stopped them. The girl sniffled and turned around to leave with the twins. She only said, "You can do it yourself." Eric shook his head and smiled. This girl hasn't been jealous for a long time. Eric almost forgot that all women were jealous. Eric looked at Diane Kruger, who was sitting next to him like a docile kitten. He shrugged and reached out to pick the girl up. Under the slightly surprised gaze of everyone backstage, he walked to the resting area. It was not until Eric put her on a chair that Diane Kruger, whose face was as red as clouds, said in a low voice, "Thank you, Mr. Williams." Eric took a stack of chocolates from the workbench and handed it to Diane Kruger. He smiled and said, "You're welcome. It's very comfortable to hold." This slightly teasing sentence made Diane Kruger's cheeks even hotter, but she still mustered up the courage to answer in a low voice, If you want, I can anytime." Before she finished stuttering, she noticed a staff member rushing over with a few pairs of high heels. Diane Kruger had no choice but to shut her mouth. The performance on the stage soon ended. Under Eric's comfort, Diane Kruger gradually recovered her strength. The 40 supermodels walked on the stage together and completed the perfect closing of this fashion show. Although there was a small accident in the middle, for most people, this Victoria's Secret show was still very satisfying. The after-party at the Gramercy Hotel on Lexington Avenue was even more exciting for the guests who were lucky enough to attend. However, when many people were having fun at the after-party, Eric and all the people in charge of the Victoria's Secret show left the venue early and gathered in the conference room of the LTD Group headquarters in New York. Eric stood in front of the board in the conference room and pasted a huge photo that had just been printed on the board. Emily, Edward Razek, and the invited editor-in-chief of Yahoo, Tina Brown, all looked at it. It was a close-up photo of the Victoria's Secret runway. Everyone could tell that it was a live photo from the lighting and the audience. Of course, the most obvious sign was the eye-catching silver high heel that was left in the middle of the runway. Eric stood aside and quietly let everyone in the conference room admire it for a moment. After that, he asked, "So, what does everyone think of when they see this photo?" What else could it be? Of course, it was the shocking moment at the Victoria's Secret show tonight. Emily thought in her heart. At that time, she was next to a big screen backstage and completely experienced the whole process of Diane Kruger's shoe falling. At that time, she was so scared that she broke out in a cold sweat. The other senior members of the project team, who were present, felt almost the same as Emily. Some of them were even a little confused now. Why didn't Eric reshoot the last theme? It was a big show that had been carefully prepared for almost half a year. In the end, a shoe was left behind. It was simply terrible. As a bystander, Tina Brown's thoughts were different from Emily and the others. She looked at the photo that Eric posted and thought for a moment. Then she spat out a word with uncertainty, "Cinderella?" "That's right," Eric nodded approvingly. "It's Cinderella." Although Eric and Tina Brown said so, the others in the conference room reacted one after another. The silver high heel that was left on the glittering runway in the photo was really like the crystal shoe that Cinderella left behind in the fairy tale. Seeing that everyone had reacted, Eric continued to explain, "I've seen all the footage after Diane's shoe fell. Diane's performance was almost the same as when the shoe didn't fall. I believe that after the post-production editing, the scene that will be shown to the audience will still be amazing. Not only that, the incident of the high heel falling this time can also become a very clever publicity point." Speaking up to this point, Eric quickly picked up a pen and wrote a line of phrases on the board. He said, "So in addition to the established marketing strategy, we have to temporarily add a publicity branch. The code name of this publicity branch will be Cinderella Incident." Chapter 671. Eric opened his eyes in a daze and realized that he had fallen asleep on the conference table. He propped himself up and saw that there were all kinds of documents, drawings, coffee cups, and a few laptops scattered on the wide conference table. Noticing that Eric had lifted his head, Tina Brown, who was tapping on the keyboard on the other side, smiled and greeted Eric, "Good morning." Eric nodded in response and his mind gradually cleared up. Soon he recalled what happened last night. Due to the sudden situation at the Victoria's Secret show last night, Eric added a Cinderella incident to the post-marketing plan of the Victoria's Secret show. After everyone finished the meeting, they began to contact various media to change the press release for the next day. Unknowingly, it was already the latter half of the night. Eric faintly remembered that it was already 4 o'clock in the morning when he could not take it anymore, and fell asleep in advance. Looking at Tina Brown, who was busy quietly beside him, and the LTD employees who were still working in the work area outside the glass door, Eric asked Tina Brown, "Don't tell me that you guys didn't rest for the entire night?" Tina Brown merely smiled softly, and turned the laptop screen in front of her to Eric. She said, "Eric, this is the topic that was rushed out from Boston overnight. Take a look and see if there's anything that needs to be changed." Eric saw the eye-catching silver high-heel picture on the screen. Although he wanted to take a hot shower and eat something right now, he was too embarrassed to reject Tina Brown's request. Just when he was about to pull the laptop over to take a look, a slight rumbling sound resonated in the conference room. Tina Brown raised her brow in confusion at first but realized something later on. She smiled and said, "I'm sorry, Eric. I forgot that you haven't eaten breakfast yet. Why don't you take a look at it later?" Eric did not reject her. Indeed, he did not have much energy to work with the combination of exhaustion and hunger. He began to miss Kelly all of a sudden. If it was any other time, the gentle and considerate female assistant would have definitely prepared breakfast for him. However, Kelly had returned to Los Angeles due to some urgent matters the day before yesterday. Standing up and stretching his body, Eric said to Tina Brown, "Have all of you had breakfast?" Tina Brown nodded and pointed at the steaming hot coffee next to her. "We ate an hour ago." "Oh yeah, there's a girl waiting for you outside the door." Eric walked out of the conference room. One of the twins, who was sitting on the sofa in the outer lounge area, quietly reading a magazine, noticed his appearance and stood up. Eric was already used to the twins always appearing together, so when he suddenly saw one alone, he suddenly felt a little unaccustomed. Realizing something, he asked tentatively, "Did the girl get into some kind of trouble, so you have to be cannon fodder?" One of the twins shook her head seriously. "No, master. The boss came last night. When he saw you working, he asked me to stay and take care of you." Eric thought that the little girl was quite considerate. He smiled and asked, "Are you the elder sister or the younger sister? And where did Drew go?" "I'm the older sister. My younger sister went to East Hampton with the boss." Eric nodded and understood that the one in front of him was Natasha. Perhaps it was because the twins were separated. Eric subconsciously thought of Natasha's younger sister's name, but in the end he still could not remember. Many Westerners always had the belief that a long name would make them look cool. However, in reality, if the name was too long, it would only make people unable to remember it. It was not cool at all. "Forget it, I'll just treat them both as Natasha. They look exactly the same anyway." Eric and Natasha spoke very casually, but the LTD employees who were busy or pretending to be busy around them were all shocked when they heard a certain sentence from the twins. "Master, master, master. This form of address is really retro." Natasha, who had a cold temperament, had been sitting quietly on the sofa in the resting area for several hours. All the employees who were working overtime were silently guessing her identity. Some male employees even boldly went up to her and said a few words. Although Natasha responded politely, she clearly had an unapproachable temperament. Everyone could feel that this temperament was not arrogant, but it was still unapproachable. Everyone could feel that this temperament was not arrogant, but it was still unapproachable. Because the Russian girl's skin was as white as snow, and she exuded an unusual quietness that stood aloof from worldly affairs. It only took a few hours for the men in the work area to silently give Natasha the nickname Little Snowman. The moment they heard Natasha's name for Eric, the sound of heartbreak almost rang out in the work area. Eric felt the sudden silence in the work area, and looked around in confusion. Everyone immediately moved under Eric's gaze, as if nothing had happened just now. Eric did not realize that anything was wrong for a moment. He took a big bag from the twins and opened it. In addition to toothbrushes and other customary utensils, there was also a bath towel. With a smile, Eric said to Natasha, I'm going to find a place to take a bath. Help me prepare breakfast, anything will do. Natasha nodded and followed Eric out of the work area. When the two figures disappeared, a strange cry of regret and unwillingness suddenly sounded in the work area. God, punish these evil capitalists. Coincidentally, the door of another office suddenly opened at this time. Emily, who was talking on her phone and walking out, suddenly raised her eyebrows and apologized. She reached out and covered the phone with her hand. Her sharp eyes looked around in the work area and locked onto a certain unlucky guy. She angrily said, "Jason, it was you who was screaming just now, wasn't it?" Amidst the snickers, the young man named Jason stood up with a sullen face and said, "Sorry, Miss Brighton, I lost my composure." Emily was still very angry and even a little wronged. She raised her voice and said, "In the year since the acquisition of LTD, I haven't fired a single person. Not only that, all of your salaries have increased by 10%. Is there anything I've done wrong to you? It's just overtime. Didn't I also work overtime here? Why should God punish me?" Jason explained with a bitter face, "Miss Brighton, I wasn't talking about you just now." Oh, Emily looked around. "Is there a second capitalist here? Do you think I'm an idiot?" There really was a second capitalist here, and it was a super capitalist. But Jason had already offended a little wild cat. He didn't dare to offend another Tyrannosaurus Rex. "Sorry, Miss Brighton, I'm very sorry." Emily was about to say something, but the phone seemed to have been hung up. Then it immediately rang again. "I don't owe you anything. If you think LTD's treatment is not good enough, then hand me your resignation letter." Emily glared at the unlucky guy and said this. She picked up the phone and hurried through the work area to the conference room. After Emily's figure disappeared, the work area was silent for a few seconds. After confirming that no big shots would appear again, there was a burst of gloating laughter. Eric returned to LTD's conference room after breakfast. The media information about yesterday's Victoria's Secret show had basically been summarized. Most of the mainstream newspapers had made a detailed report on the Victoria's Secret show. Many of the headlines were occupied by the Victoria's Secret angels in gorgeous angel costumes. In order to attract as much attention as possible, the newspaper editors racked their brains to find their own focus. Some paid attention to models, some discussed fashion, and some focused on music. Of course, there were also various comments in the media. The Washington Post praised the Victoria's Secret show as a gorgeous visual feast. The Chicago Sun's commentator disdainfully criticized the Victoria's Secret show as a jaw-dropping shameless farce. With the control of the powerful media resources in their hands, most of the negative comments barely caused any waves. Through the special feature of Yahoo, the largest media website on the internet, the report of ABC television network's morning news, the close cooperation of the Hearst Group, the News Corporation, the Washington Post, and other print media forces that were closely related to the Firefly Group, and with the full force of online media, television media, and print media, although the image of the Victoria's Secret show in the public's mind could not be considered perfect, it was definitely highly anticipated. Diane Kruger's shoe accident on the runway was quickly rendered into an industry story similar to Cinderella's fairy tale under clever marketing methods. Many ordinary people who did not pay attention to the Victoria's Secret show even began to look forward to Diane Kruger's shoe accident in the Victoria's Secret show. At the same time, the discount generated by the grand marketing that lasted for several months was also amazing. At the beginning of the year, when Chris took the absolute control of LTD with a sky-high valuation of $2.4 billion, most analysts in the industry were pessimistic about the deal and predicted that LTD's stock price would definitely fall again after the deal. However, these people only calculated the beginning and did not guess the ending. After the restructuring of LTD Group, the stock price did experience a fall in the initial period. However, after Eric announced the Victoria's Secret annual show, the sales of Victoria's Secret underwear rose at an amazing speed after 6 months of continuous marketing. Victoria's Secret was the most important brand under LTD. Even after the merger of LTD and Brighton Fashion, the Victoria's Secret brand still accounted for more than half of the new group. With the continued rise of Victoria's Secret underwear sales and brand awareness, Ltd's stock market value began to rise slowly for 6 months after the initial fall of $1 billion. On the second day of the Victoria's Secret show, Ltd's stock price rose by 7.5% again, and the stock market value was close to $3.7 billion. It was expected that after the Victoria's Secret show in December, Ltd's total market value would exceed $4 billion. Most importantly, this breakthrough was not a capital bubble because Ltd's stock price at this time was supported by a very solid brand value and product sales. After the initial acquisition, Firefly Investment and the Brighton family held 62% of Ltd's shares. When Ltd's market value exceeded $4 billion, compared to the initial total assets and cash expenditure of about $1 billion, the assets in the hands of Firefly Investment and the Brighton family had increased by $1.5 billion in just 1 year. This was equivalent to the net profit of the entire Firefly Group this year. When Fortune magazine revealed this series of data, the media, who were originally enthusiastically calculating how much loss Eric would suffer if he gave up on making a movie, and turned to making an underwear show that had no commercial value at all, shut their mouths. After all, even if he made a movie that was comparable to the box office of Jurassic Park, it was absolutely impossible to bring in $1.5 billion in profits within a year. After the Victoria's Secret show, the most stressful period for Eric was finally over. When the follow-up media publicity was on track, Eric left all the trivial work of Ltd to Emily and focused on editing the Victoria's Secret show on TV. At the same time, after November, the end-of-year holiday of 1994 was approaching. Some second- and third-tier film companies began to release their films in the second week of November. Firefly only released 2 films directly at the end of the year: Julia's return to the romantic film genre Runaway Bride, and Nicolas Cage's Face Off. In addition to these 2 films, Little Girls Flower Pictures opened with Kevin Costner's version of Mission Impossible. Brian De Palma's skillful suspense technique matched with Kevin Costner's unique and restrained masculine temperament. Although the brand new Mission Impossible did not have Tom Cruise, it had its own unique charm. After Law Enforcement failed miserably during the summer, the results of Mission Impossible could be said to be related to whether he could continue to maintain his status as a celebrity. Therefore, Kevin Costner was also very attentive to the promotion of Mission Impossible. A month before the movie was released, he began to frequently travel around to promote it. The test screening of Mission Impossible also received a good reputation. Moreover, another thing that Eric was happy to see was that in the wind of the salary reduction that he instigated, Warner Brothers was forced by various pressures to quickly take over Kevin Costner's long-prepared future water world. Just like in the original universe, they chose Hawaii as the filming location. In Eric's memory, it was because the frequent waves in Hawaii washed away the filming set built by the crew time and time again, causing the budget to finally be pushed to a jaw-dropping sky-high price. MGM originally planned to release Resident Evil at the end of the year. Although this R-rated zombie film was not in line with the style of the low holiday schedule, it often achieved unexpected results by going against the trend. What's more, the production budget of Resident Evil was only more than $30 million, plus the post-production marketing budget. The costs would not exceed $50 million. Through box office and video operations and other channels, there was not much pressure to recoup the cost and make a profit. As long as the first film made a name for itself, and continued to produce sequels like the original, it could create a stable and profitable project for DreamWorks Productions. However, there were some problems with the post-production of this zombie film, and the release had to be delayed until the Easter period. Sony's executive vice president, Nobuyuki Ide, began to personally intervene in the film business of Sony in the second half of the year. By the end of the year, although Peter Guber still maintained his position as Columbia's CEO, he was basically a figurehead. Sony had begun to look for the next Columbia CEO with great fanfare. Michael Lynn, who had just resigned from Firefly Pictures in September, even received an invitation. However, Michael Lynn did not intend to get involved in the mess that was Sony Columbia. He only informed Eric of the news through a phone call. Although Peter Guber was destined to be kicked out, Sony did not slack off on the release of Columbia and Firefly's Game of the Brave. As the only CG-based special effects film at the end of the year, Sony obviously had high hopes for Game of the Brave. While the whole of Hollywood was busy dealing with the upcoming hot schedule, Eric only flew back to Los Angeles to attend a Firefly's year-end executive meeting. After that, he hurried back to New York and continued to work in the editing room of ABC's program production department. Other than promising to support the premiere of Julia and his wife's 2 films, Eric did not intend to get involved in the film's marketing. A boss who knew how to let go was a good boss. This was what Eric had learned from Warren Buffett recently. Warren Buffett had a very tacit relationship with many of Hathaway's companies. In an interview, when a manager of a subsidiary of Hathaway was asked why the subsidiary was doing so well, the manager's answer was very thought-provoking. The manager said that it was because Warren Buffett had forgotten that he had acquired the company, and he had also forgotten that the company had been acquired by Warren Buffett. As the scale of the assets under his name grew larger and larger, if he could not find a reasonable balance between delegating and seizing power, Eric would definitely be overwhelmed by the heavy workload. Many times, Eric even faintly felt this kind of pressure. Chapter 672. At ABC's Program Production Center, Emily walked into a studio with her assistant, who was holding a thick stack of documents. She looked at the busy crowd recording for the Victoria's Secret show and waited patiently for a while. Eric, who had been notified, walked out of the crowd. Noticing the serious expression on Emily's face, Eric took her to a temporary office and asked his secretary to make coffee. He then asked, "Is there a result from that incident?" Emily nodded, then shook her head. She spread out the documents in her assistant's hands and handed them to Eric. "The FBI in Manhattan checked all the video information we provided, but they didn't find anything. There were too many people going in and out of the backstage in the last 2 days. In addition, there was no problem with the fingerprints. Obviously, the person who did this is very smart." The two were talking about the shoe incident on the night of the Victoria's Secret show. Although the media had rendered the time when Diane Kruger's high heels fell into a story similar to Cinderella's, the story behind the incident didn't seem so beautiful. According to the FBI's examination of the broken shoelace was indeed broken by someone. Eric read the report in his hand and asked, "Did they find out how the shoelace was tampered with?" Emily took out her handbag and took out a delicate nail file and a thin rope. In front of Eric, she gently scratched the rope with the file for a while and handed it over. "Here it's like this. Someone used a nail file, so the broken part looks like it broke naturally. But according to the FBI's report, the direction of the broken shoelace is horizontal. If it broke naturally, the force of the broken shoelace should be vertical." Eric picked up the rope that Emily handed over, which was only connected by a little thread. With a slight tug, it broke into 2 pieces. He shook his head helplessly. "This is really..." Noticing Eric's eyes drifting to the nail file, Emily said, "There's no way to investigate this at all. Every angel in the makeup area had a set of tools, and..." Emily paused and said, "Inspector Linney from the FBI told me that unless we file a case with great fanfare, we won't be able to find any results at all. However, he also said that he's done everything he can for us. If we file a case with great fanfare, the media won't be able to hide it. They'll bear a lot of risks, and will definitely be criticized." Although the Victoria's Secret show had been over for a few days, the media's attention to it didn't seem to be waning. Before that, some tabloid newspapers had speculated about the fall of Diane Kruger's high-heeled shoes on the runway. Now this matter had been rendered into a beautiful accident. If they investigated it with great fanfare, the fairy tale that had just been created would instantly collapse. If the FBI filed a case for investigation because of a shoelace, they would definitely be labeled as making a mountain out of a molehill by the media. This incident required the on-site staff to be questioned, and there was no way to invite a private detective to investigate. "If that's the case, then forget it," Eric said as he shook his head and reluctantly held the nail file. Hearing that Eric had given up on the investigation, Emily breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't that she wanted to protect the murderer, But with the current situation, no matter from which point of view, suspending the investigation was a matter of more advantages than disadvantages. After this matter was resolved, Emily immediately talked about something else. Eric, where do you plan to spend Thanksgiving? Malibu, Eric said as he recalled the situation last year. There was a look of anticipation on his face. He could gather the women together and sleep with them. This was a once-a-year opportunity, so he definitely couldn't miss it. I'll be in Malibu for Thanksgiving and in New York for Christmas. Why? Emily's shrewd and capable aura disappeared. She hesitated for a moment like a little girl and said, Can you change your itinerary? For Thanksgiving. Accompany Chris and me to Maryland. Oh, it's best to bring Xia and the rest. Eric thought about it and understood what was going on. Jeffrey was currently living in seclusion on a farm in Maryland and rarely went to New York and Los Angeles. As filial sons and future daughters-in-law, Chris and Emily would definitely go back to Maryland to accompany their old man on Thanksgiving. However, as two young bachelors who were old in age, they would definitely be forced to get married every festive season. Eric laughed gloatingly and shook his head. No, I'm not going. Besides, this is for your own good. If I bring my family to Maryland to spend Thanksgiving with you, Jeffrey will definitely want grandchildren, even more when he sees Kevin and Xia. Won't you guys be under even more pressure? Emily glared at Eric. Forget it if you don't want to go. I've never seen anyone gloat as much as you. Eric still had a smile on his face. Isn't Chris still in Europe? If you're really afraid of this, you can discuss it with Chris and ask him to find an excuse to come back after Thanksgiving. Emily said. Jeffrey personally called Europe. Chris has already agreed. Besides, even if Chris won't do what you said. Eric leaned back in his leather chair and spread his hands. Then I can't do anything about it. In my opinion, why don't you guys just get married? Even if you don't plan to get married, you can have a child first. I just turned 30. Stop, you're too pretentious. If I didn't know better, I would think that you're only 13 years old. You're making those girls who became mothers in their teens feel bad. Emily glared at Eric and curled her lips. She stood up and said, I really don't have anything to say to you guys who are full of male chauvinism. I'm leaving. Eric sent Emily off and returned to the studio. Everyone had just finished filming some scenes and was resting. Eric checked the effects of the shoot and walked over to the 5 Victoria's Secret spokespersons who were resting. Today, they were going to record some highlights between each theme of the Victoria's Secret show. Although it involved other Victoria's Secret angels, most of the highlights were still focused on the 5 spokespersons. Noticing Eric walking into the lounge, the 5 angel supermodels sitting around the sofa drinking coffee greeted Eric together. Eric smiled and nodded. He watched Diane Kruger get up and pour him a cup of coffee. He thanked her and sat down on a single sofa nearby. He casually took out a manicure knife from his pocket and played with it a few times. He chatted casually with the others and started to manicure his nails casually. The 5 Victoria's Secret angels noticed Eric's actions and had different expressions on their faces. Christy Durrington and Linda Evangelista had a faint smile on their faces. Cindy Crawford's expression was a little puzzled at first. Then a hint of understanding flashed across her face, but it was quickly covered up by a smile. Tyra Banks and Diane Kruger picked up their coffee cups and covered their expressions, trying to make their eyes look normal. Eric took in the expressions of the 5 women. His gaze paused on Cindy Crawford's face for a moment before he quickly looked away. He asked the women, Is there a problem? Eric, that's not how you use a manicure knife. Linda Evangelista smiled and put down her coffee cup. She stretched out her slender fingers and gestured a few times. She said, Your nails will look ugly if you do it like that. Eric finally understood why the 5 women had such expressions. He shrugged indifferently. Just as he was about to say that he didn't care if his nails looked good, he pointed at Cindy Crawford and said, Cindy, help me demonstrate how to use it. Cindy Crawford looked at Tyra Banks and Diane Kruger sitting on her right. The two of them were closer to Eric than she was. Why did this guy ask her to demonstrate? Thinking back to just now, Cindy Crawford's heart suddenly jumped. She suddenly realized that her reaction just now must have caused this guy to misunderstand something. How despicable. How could he think that she was the one who did it? Even if Diane Kruger became popular in the modeling circle, she wouldn't be much of a threat to her. She wouldn't gain much by doing this. Cindy Crawford looked at Tyra Banks next to her. Although Tyra Banks debuted a few years earlier than Diane Kruger, her fame was not much higher than Diane Kruger's. Among the 5 spokespersons, the 2 of them were in a competitive relationship. If Diane Kruger screwed up, Tyra Banks would obviously benefit more among the 5. However, Cindy Crawford didn't dare to say anything on the spot. She just obediently got up and walked over at Eric's request. When she took the manicure knife from Eric's hand and was about to return it, she saw Eric stretch out his big hand to her. Okay, hateful man. Cindy Crawford was angry, but her face had already put on a very skillful expression of resentment. She gently squatted down to help Eric demonstrate how to use the manicure knife. Noticing this scene, Christy Dington immediately stood up as if she had just remembered something. She said, "I think I need to touch up my makeup. I seem to have put on a lot of lip gloss. I need to reapply it." Linda Evangelista found an excuse almost at the same time. The 2 women couldn't wait to get up and walk out. Tyra Banks looked at the actions of the 2 seniors, and although she did not find any reason, she also stood up and walked out. Diane Kruger, who also stood up, had a little resentment on her face. Shouldn't this kind of thing be done by me? Why did he call for Cindy Crawford? Soon, only Eric and Cindy Crawford were left in the lounge. Seeing the door gently closed, Cindy Crawford didn't stop what she was doing. She looked at Eric with a wronged expression and said, "I didn't do it." "I know." Cindy Crawford waved the manicure knife in her hand. "Then why did you?" Eric took the manicure knife and threw it into the trash can next to him. He said, "I knew someone was messing with me, but I couldn't investigate. I'm very angry now." "Cindy, what do you do when you're angry?" "Shopping." "Oh, what a typical woman. You're discriminating." Cindy Crawford's eyes flashed and asked, "What about you?" Eric reached out and pressed Cindy Crawford's shoulder. "Guess." Cindy Crawford lay on Eric's lap, looking very obedient. She felt Eric's fingertips brushing across her face, as if he was stroking something. The woman said with some resistance, "You can't do this." Eric didn't force her at all. He withdrew his hand and said, "Go out and let Diane in." Cindy Crawford's body stiffened, but she didn't get up. She whispered, "Despicable man." Eric had a triumphant smile on his face. He gently patted Cindy Crawford's face and said, "Hurry up, I'll give you 15 minutes. During the editing of the Victoria's Secret show, the ratings of ABC's Survivor continued to soar. In November, the average number of viewers per episode had exceeded 33 million. As long as there were no accidents, the Victoria's Secret annual show would have a very high viewership rating on the final episode of Survivor on December 6th. At the same time, the Thanksgiving period officially kicked off on November 11th. Many new films started shooting at the same time on this day. Although the number of tickets sold during the new year was much lower than during the summer, the intensity of the competition was much higher than during the summer. Julia once again ventured into romance films after 5 years. With the excellent reputation of the film and the remaining box office appeal of Pretty Woman, Runaway Bride received $28 million in the first week. Although this result wasn't amazing, the total box office exceeded $100 million. Compared to the production cost of $30 million, the return on investment of Runaway Bride could be said to be higher than many big-budget films. After Runaway Bride, Kevin Costner's version of Mission Impossible was released on November 18th. Eric promised to support Xiao and I, so he returned to Los Angeles on November 17th and appeared on time outside the Los Angeles Music Hall where the premiere was held. Compared to Runaway Bride, which could only be considered a medium-low budget film, the premiere of Mission Impossible was much grander. Walking out of the limousine, Eric walked across the long red carpet and casually accepted a few interviews before he was led backstage by the staff. Eric hugged the girl who floated over and greeted Amy Pascal and the others. He then chatted with the creators of Mission Impossible, Brian De Palma, Kevin Costner, and the others. Kevin Costner naturally didn't need to be introduced. Brian De Palma had been focusing on horror and thrillers that were difficult to import, so his reputation in the East was not so conspicuous. However, he had many classic films in his hands such as Carrie, Scarface, and so on. Moreover, there was another thing that interested Eric very much about this thriller director in his 50s. In his memory, a family of 3 originally from a noble family in the Soviet Union fled to the United States because of the political turmoil. The husband and wife soon divorced. The wife, who was once an actress, wanted to continue her career. Because of the language barrier, she ended up working as a maid in the home of Brian De Palma, a well-known Hollywood director. This maid named Galina Jovovich had a daughter named Mila Jovovich. Moreover, this story would continue and involve a large group of filmmakers. Every time Eric thought about this, he would feel that Hollywood was really small. Chapter 673. Eric was chatting with everyone when a few people appeared at the backstage entrance and walked directly towards him. The leader was a Japanese man in his 50s. He was Nobuyuki Ide, who was about to take over Norio Oga's position as Sony's CEO. Columbia's CEO, Peter Guber, President Chang Peters, and other company executives followed him. However, Eric found that the person following Nobuyuki Ide was not either Peter Guber or Chang Peters, but another middle-aged white man with an unfamiliar face. Eric knew that Sony had begun to intervene in Columbia's affairs a few months ago, but he did not expect Nobuyuki Ide to suddenly appear here. Before he had time to think about the reason, Nobuyuki Ide had already come to his side. He reached out his hand with a smile and said in fluent English, "Mr. Williams, nice to meet you. I am Nobuyuki Ide." The English pronunciation of Japanese names was very strange. Eric could not distinguish the difference between the names of the other party. He had to shake hands with the other party and said in full, "Hello, Mr. Nobuyuki Ide. Welcome to the premiere of Mission Impossible. This should be my honor. The movie that Mr. Williams personally chose must be very exciting," Nobuyuki Ide complimented. Without waiting for Eric to thank him, he gestured to the middle-aged white man next to him to say to Eric, "This is Mr. Howard Stringer. He has accepted Sony's invitation to be the CEO of Sony's American branch. He will be in charge of all Sony's industries in the United States." Eric heard Nobuyuki Ide say the other party's name, and confirmed who the middle-aged white man with glasses was. He was the first non-Japanese CEO of Sony after Nobuyuki Ide stepped down. "Hello, Mr. Stringer." After Nobuyuki Ide introduced Howard Stringer, he did not have any intention of introducing Peter Guber and Chang Peters, but he expressed interest in the others present. Eric had to introduce them one by one. When it was Amy Pascal's turn, Nobuyuki Ide did not hide the regret in his tone. "Miss Pascal, losing you is really Columbia's biggest loss. I hope you can seriously consider returning to Columbia." Amy Pascal was a little surprised by Nobuyuki Ide's straightforward invitation, but she only responded politely. After a brief conversation, it was time for the premiere. The staff began to guide the guests backstage to the screening room. Eric purposely lagged behind. When most of the guests had left, the female assistant beside him took the initiative to explain to Eric, "Nobuyuki Ide arrived in Los Angeles a week ago. We received news that Nobuyuki Ide personally brought an audit team to investigate Columbia's financial information. In addition, Nobuyuki Ide's other purpose in coming to Los Angeles should be to find the next leader of Columbia." Eric nodded and remembered the bespectacled middle-aged man that Nobuyuki Ide had specially introduced to him. He asked, "Do you know anything about Howard Stringer?" Kelly said, "Howard Stringer has been the president of CBS for the past few years. He just left a few months ago. He started out as a very good reporter. When he was the head of the CBS News department, the CBS Evening News had the highest ratings among the 3 major television networks at that time. In recent years, perhaps because of the internal instability of CBS, he did not make any outstanding achievements as the president of CBS." Eric thought for a while and asked, "How is he compared to Robert Agar?" Kelly shook her head. "I only have some basic information about him. If you need a detailed evaluation, I will get someone to do it tomorrow." Eric was not very interested in Howard Stringer, but he did not refuse the female assistant to collect more detailed information. He said, "Also collect information about Nobuyuki Ide." Compared to the CEO after the decline of Sony, Eric was more interested in Nobuyuki Ide, the leader who brought Sony from its peak to its decline. Since Nobuyuki Ide suddenly appeared, he and Eric's seats were naturally arranged together. Eric had watched the new version of Mission Impossible several times, but he did not pay much attention to the screen. Nobuyuki Ide's mind was obviously not on the movie. During the 120 minutes of watching the movie, the two tried to sound each other out a few times. Eric almost understood the purpose of Nobuyuki Ide's visit, and Nobuyuki Ide obviously understood Eric's attitude. After the premiere, Nobuyuki Ide took the initiative to invite Eric when he was leaving. "Eric, I will be staying in Los Angeles for a while. Do you have the honor to talk to me?" Eric knew that since Nobuyuki Ide appeared in Los Angeles, the two sides must inevitably have a formal meeting. "Of course, no problem. Ide, get someone to contact my assistant to confirm the time." Nobuyuki Ide smiled and agreed. After saying goodbye to Eric, he got into the car. After driving for some distance, Nobuyuki Ide's face was gloomy. In the past few days, in the process of reviewing the detailed information of Columbia, Nobuyuki Ide found that the problem of Columbia was much more serious than the headquarters thought. In the past few years, Peter Guber and Chong Peters ran Columbia. They did not make any decisions that were beneficial to Columbia Pictures at all. Instead, they unscrupulously drained the company's finances. The two men not only took a lot of salary and bonuses, but also squandered the funds that should have been used for the company's development on personal enjoyment. In the past few years, the total cost of Columbia's office decorations, private jets, and luxury yachts was as high as $170 million. If Peter Guber and Chong Peters worked hard to run Columbia, these expenses would not hurt the foundation of this veteran film company. However, the two of them had never put any effort into running Columbia. In the past 5 years, Columbia's only outstanding achievement was the film cooperation with Firefly. But these cooperation were not so simple. Sony had discovered that because of the cooperation between Firefly and Columbia, Columbia's overseas distribution network was half paralyzed. When Nobuyuki Ide remembered that his old rival Panasonic and Canada's Seagram Group were in the final negotiations for the Universal Pictures deal, Nobuyuki Ide could not help but want to retreat. But with Columbia's current situation, Sony had no way out. Columbia's current situation was not much better than MGM. Sony had spent $5 billion to acquire Columbia. If Sony sold Columbia now, even if they discounted the original purchase price, no one would be willing to take over. And even if someone was willing to take over, Sony would not dare to sell Columbia at a low price under the strong pressure from various parties. In this case, Sony could only grit their teeth and continue to operate Columbia. Although Sony was cheated by Firefly during the initial cooperation, but now the rights to Men in Black, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Game of the Brave, and other films, and the distribution rights to Mission Impossible, Forrest Gump, and Night at the Museum, were undoubtedly the most valuable resources in Columbia's hands. Although Nobuyuki Ide hated these Hollywood profiteers, he knew that if he wanted to maintain Columbia, he must make full use of these resources. Especially the sequels to Men in Black and Mr. and Mrs. Smith. These two blockbusters had grossed more than $500 million at the global box office. With the reputation of the first film, the sequels would definitely bring in considerable profits for Columbia. Nobuyuki Ide attended the premiere of Mission Impossible today to test Eric's attitude towards the sequels. Without Firefly's cooperation, unless legal means were used, it would be difficult to start the sequels to Men in Black and Mr. and Mrs. Smith. But Columbia was now in trouble, and Nobuyuki Ide didn't want to cause another lawsuit. However, when he thought of Eric Williams's ambiguous attitude during the premiere, Nobuyuki Ide couldn't help but rub his temples. Since this matter couldn't be solved in a short period of time, Nobuyuki Ide thought about the next leader of Columbia. He looked up and asked his assistant sitting in the front seat, "Fujita, did you reply to Michael Ovitz's invitation?" "Yes, President. Mr. Ovitz has agreed to meet with you next Monday." With a wonderful plot and excellent marketing, Mission Impossible easily grossed $38.5 million at the box office in more than 2,900 theaters in the first weekend. Many media outlets gave very positive reviews to Kevin Costner's comeback after the failure of Law Enforcement. The LA Times even praised that Mission Impossible completely broke the shackles of the TV version. The plot is exciting, the scenes are dazzling, and Kevin Costner vividly portrays the image of a tenacious agent who comes back from the jaws of death. With the excellent reputation and box office in the first 3 days, evaluation agencies predicted that Mission Impossible would gross $160 million to $180 million in North America. Because another agent movie starring Kevin Costner, The Bodyguard, had a global box office of $410 million, and Mission Impossible was better in terms of quality and marketing. Therefore, box office evaluation agencies were more optimistic about the global box office of Mission Impossible. Most agencies predicted that the global box office of Mission Impossible would be no less than $500 million. The production and marketing costs of Mission Impossible were kept within $110 million, of which $40 million in marketing costs were shared by Flower Pictures and Columbia. Although Flower Pictures had invested $90 million in Mission Impossible based on the global average box office forecast of $500 million, Flower Pictures would be able to recoup about $130 million just from the box office alone. If they recouped all of their costs, they would still bring in $40 million in profit. The income from the subsequent video and TV broadcast rights of Mission Impossible would be even more lucrative. In the new week, at Universal Studios in Burbank, Michael Eisner sat in his office early as usual. There was a hint of envy between his eyebrows as he read the weekend box office report that had just been sent by his assistant. After reading the report about Mission Impossible, Michael Eisner continued to look at the box office rankings, and his eyes fell on The Little Guy, that was released at the same time by Universal. This was a project that Michael Ovitz personally handled after he became the president of Universal. The total box office for the first 3 days of this family comedy that used a man's pregnancy as a gimmick was only $68 million. Although it squeezed into the top 5 box office rankings, it was not even a fraction of the box office of Mission Impossible. Of course, Michael Eisner would not expect such a comedy with only a $30 million investment to be able to reach the box office of Mission Impossible. He just thought of Michael Ovitz's idea for this film. Michael Ovitz actually wanted to invite Arnold Schwarzenegger to be the male lead. With Arnold Schwarzenegger's net worth after True Lies, once Arnold Schwarzenegger was invited, the production and marketing budget of the film would also be raised at the same time. The production cost alone could reach $60 million. When the Little Guy project was confirmed, although Michael Eisner was still recovering from heart surgery and needed Michael Ovitz to help him manage Universal's affairs, he still firmly rejected Michael Ovitz's proposal. The two even had a private argument, and the decades of friendship also had a crack at that time. But now, looking at the box office data in his hands, Michael Eisner did not regret his decision. Instead, he was vaguely glad. The box office of The Little Guy was only $68 million in the first weekend, and the total box office forecast for this film was only $30 million. However, although this number was still less than the box office of Mission Impossible in the first weekend, The Little Guy would definitely still bring in a good amount of revenue for Universal through overseas distribution, video, and other peripheral channels. But if they had followed Michael Ovitz's suggestion, this project would have definitely caused Universal a huge loss. With this in mind, Michael Eisner could not help but count the series of ideas that Michael Ovitz proposed since he joined the company. He could not help but shake his head. Now the negotiations between Panasonic and Seagram Group had entered the final stage. Michael Eisner once again made up his mind. No matter what, he had to kick Michael Ovitz out of Universal during this negotiation. Although the Golden Parachute agreement signed with Michael Ovitz under his leadership made Michael Eisner feel like he was trapped in a cocoon of his own making, but when he thought about Sony's recent secret contact with Michael Ovitz and Panasonic's eagerness to get rid of Universal, Michael Eisner became more confident in kicking Michael Ovitz out of Universal. The assistant's knock on the door woke up Michael Eisner from his deep thoughts. "Mr. Eisner, Mr. Bronfman from Seagram is here." Chapter 674. With regards to Worldwide, both Panasonic and Seagram were very eager to make a deal. In the past few months, the two sides had already reached a preliminary agreement. They only needed to sort out the last bit of debt information and personnel differences before they could complete the final deal. In the past few months, Michael Eisner had been lobbying Edgar Bronfman, the head of Seagram, to help him kick Michael Ovitz out of Worldwide. For this reason, he did not hesitate to exaggerate Michael Ovitz's various inappropriate behaviors during his time as the president of Worldwide. Michael Ovitz was already used to using CAA's account to satisfy his own extravagant personal expenses. CAA was a private partnership company and did not need to constantly pay attention to financial reports like a listed company. As the founder of CAA, Michael Ovitz also had a very unique position in the agency. Therefore, no one dared to question his extravagant behavior. However, after becoming the president of Worldwide, Michael Ovitz did not realize that he had been promoted from a private company to an executive of a large listed company. Instead, he continued to maintain the lifestyle he had at CAA. He almost took it for granted that the expenses of decorating his luxurious office, or giving expensive gifts to Hollywood celebrities, should be reimbursed by Worldwide. This also created the first contradiction between him and Michael Eisner. Michael Eisner did not agree with Michael Ovitz's somewhat arbitrary behavior. At the same time, Michael Ovitz's strong desire to control at CAA also conflicted with Michael Eisner's strong personality. This was also the source of the conflict between the two. In the end, the conflict between the two confirmed the old saying that two tigers could not live on the same mountain. As the head of Seagram, Edgar Bronfman was certainly aware of this. After listening to Michael Eisner criticize Michael Ovitz not long after his arrival, Edgar Bronfman decided to kick Michael Ovitz out of Worldwide in advance before the deal was completed. Of course, Michael Eisner's lobbying was the result of this. However, as the head of a large consortium, Edgar Bronfman thought more about the stability of Worldwide after Seagram acquired the company. He did not want to buy a film company with many conflicts between the senior management. Although he was an outsider in Hollywood, Edgar Bronfman also knew that no matter what industry, internal management stability was necessary for a company to develop and grow. After Eisner finished speaking, Edgar Bronfman said, "Michael, I just want to know one thing. If you want Ovitz to leave Worldwide, how much will you have to pay?" Michael Eisner's face turned red and he coughed awkwardly. If it was not for the golden parachute agreement that he personally instigated, it would have been very easy to kick Michael Ovitz out of the company. This matter was ultimately his mistake, but Michael Eisner would definitely not admit this. Moreover, he had no choice when he made this decision. It was not easy for him to fully control Worldwide, and he did not want Panasonic to interfere with the management changes at Worldwide because of the heart surgery. According to the agreement that was signed, if Ovitz was asked to leave without any major mistakes, Worldwide would have to compensate him with $50 million in cash and another $50 million worth of stock options. After Michael Eisner finished speaking, he looked at Bronfman's expression and immediately added, "However, if Ovitz leaves voluntarily, Worldwide would have to pay a much smaller price. I heard that Sony is currently in contact with Ovitz and wants him to be the CEO of Columbia. It is very likely that he will leave voluntarily. Of course, even if Ovitz is not willing to leave voluntarily, we can also use this opportunity to add Ovitz's resignation into the agreement and let the Japanese bear the cost of his resignation." After listening to Michael Eisner, Edgar Bronfman tapped on the armrest of his chair and pondered for a moment. He said, "How about this? You organize the information about Ovitz that you have told me recently. In the afternoon, I will submit the information to Panasonic's negotiation team as evidence that Ovitz is no longer suitable to be the CEO of Worldwide. We will officially include the terms of Ovitz's resignation in the negotiation." Michael Eisner's face flashed with joy. He nodded and said, "I will prepare it now." At the end of 1994, Hollywood was once again in turmoil. Columbia's internal management began to shake, and Universal Pictures was once again faced with a change of ownership. The already eye-catching Flower Pictures lived up to expectations and stood out with the success of Mission Impossible. It was like another firefly that had begun to shine. Michael Ovitz put down the Hollywood Reporter in his hand and went through all the major events in Hollywood recently. He was disappointed to find that none of this had much to do with him. This made him involuntarily recall a few years ago when he was still the head of CAA. Not only did he have control over several major film companies, but he also single-handedly led Sony's acquisition of Columbia and Panasonic's acquisition of Global, two deals that involved billions of USD. But now, although he was very unwilling to admit it, Michael Ovitz found that after leaving CAA, it was as if he had suddenly been reduced from a Hollywood trader to a chess piece. After operating CAA for 20 years, Michael Ovitz had accumulated a net worth of hundreds of millions. But for someone like him who had been at the top of Hollywood for a long time, losing power was definitely 100 times more painful than losing money. Michael Ovitz knew very well that the moment he sold all his shares in CAA, it was impossible for him to return to the agent industry. After his friendship with Michael Eisner broke down, there was no point in staying at Universal. Michael Ovitz had to start thinking about his next step. Fortunately, the turmoil in Columbia gave him a chance to make a comeback. The car drove into the Columbia Film Studio in Culver City. As soon as Michael Ovitz got out of the car, Nobuyuki Ide had already come up to him with a few attendants. A few years ago, when Sony acquired Columbia, Michael Ovitz had already dealt with Nobuyuki Ide. Although he could feel that Nobuyuki Ide was filled with unconcealable fatigue and anxiety, Michael Ovitz still gave him a warm hug. There were obviously a lot of Asian faces coming in and out of the Columbia Film Studios administrative building. Nobuyuki Ide even brought Michael Ovitz into Peter Guber's former luxurious office, but Peter Guber and Chang Peters were not there. They sat down in the office, and after a simple greeting, Nobuyuki Ide said bluntly, "Mr. Ovitz, you must already know that Columbia is in a very bad situation now. Sony desperately needs a manager who can reverse the current decline. In Hollywood, any film company will go through ups and downs. Columbia has decades of accumulation, and it also has the support of a large corporation like Sony. It is only a matter of time before it recovers," Michael Ovitz said confidently. Of course, the premise of all this is that this film company needs a qualified manager. Nobuyuki Ide nodded in agreement and said, "Then Mr. Ovitz, since you accepted my invitation today, you must be very interested in the position of Columbia's CEO. Can you talk about how you plan to manage this company first?" Michael Ovitz thought for a moment and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Ide, as a film company, there is only one way to survive, and that is to produce outstanding blockbuster films. When I was at CAA, I successfully promoted dozens of film projects to Hollywood studios every year. I believe that in the whole of Hollywood, there are not many people who have more experience in film project management than me." Although the tripartite situation in Hollywood had greatly weakened CAA's dominance, Michael Ovitz's achievements in CAA were still obvious to all. The reason why Nobuyuki Ide chose Michael Ovitz was mainly because of his achievements in CAA. After listening to Michael Ovitz, Nobuyuki Ide nodded slightly and said, "Mr. Ovitz, since that is the case, Sony welcomes you to take over Columbia. What are your requirements in terms of annual salary?" "My requirements for annual salary are not high, as long as it is." After a pause, Michael Ovitz realized that Nobuyuki Ide did not want to hear Peter Guber's name. So he changed his words. "As long as it is the same as the previous CEO, it is fine. But I need to get the bonuses and dividends after the company's operating situation improves." Nobuyuki Ide was very satisfied with Michael Ovitz's conditions. He nodded and said, "Of course, as long as Columbia's operating situation improves, you will definitely get the compensation you deserve. So is there anything else?" Michael Ovitz said, "Yes, and most importantly, I don't want the company to be restricted by external factors in the process of operating, so I need to have absolute autonomy in Columbia." When he heard the words autonomy, Nobuyuki Ide's body trembled. If he had not given the autonomy to those two bastards, Peter Guber and Chong Peters, Columbia would not have fallen to this state. Nobuyuki Ide had not had a good night's sleep for the past few days. After 5 years of squandering by Peter Guber and Chong Peters, Columbia's internal operating and financial situation had deteriorated to a shocking state. In order to reduce the losses and reduce the tax burden, Sony had to take measures to write down Columbia's assets. Based on the recent statistics, Columbia's assets would be written down by $1 billion. This also meant that Sony's annual financial report would have a huge loss of $1 billion. $1 billion. Sony had never suffered such a large loss since it was established half a century ago. Nobuyuki Ide did not dare to report this bad news back to Sony's headquarters. Chairman Morita Akio had just suffered a stroke a few years ago, and Nobuyuki Ide was worried that Morita Akio would be fine after hearing about this bad news. Now, when he heard the words autonomy from Michael Ovitz, Nobuyuki Ide felt a chill down his spine. He shook his head and said, "Mr. Ovitz, we can discuss other conditions, but please do not mention the autonomy again. You should have seen it for yourself. Sony had suffered a lot because of the management rights, and we will not let a single person manage Columbia." Michael Ovitz said, "Mr. Ide, you should know that I am different from Peter Guber. To be honest, I still do not understand why Sony hired those two incompetent people. I am confident that I can run Columbia well, but I need to have enough authority and trust. If Sony loses trust in the next manager of Columbia because of Peter Guber, I am sure that it will be hard for Columbia to recover. Hollywood is different from other industries. Hollywood studios need a paternalistic management style, and not the so-called modern management style. Look at the management structure of the 7 major studios, and you will know that I am not lying. Sony's attitude of letting Peter Guber go was not wrong. The biggest mistake was that you chose the wrong person." Nobuyuki Ide hesitated. He knew that Michael Ovitz's view was not wrong, but Sony had just been bitten by the viper. It was impossible for them to not be afraid of Nobuyuki Ide. "How about this? It's already dinner time, why don't?" Nobuyuki Ide was about to invite Michael Ovitz to dinner and continue their discussion when an assistant knocked on the door and walked towards the two people who were in the middle of their discussion. "President, I think you need to take a look at this," the assistant said and looked at Michael Ovitz with a strange look. He passed a fax document to Nobuyuki Ide. Nobuyuki Ide opened the document curiously. He knew that the assistant would not barge into this meeting for no reason. There must be some important information in the document. After hurriedly reading a few pages, Nobuyuki Ide raised his head and asked the assistant who was still waiting beside him, "Where did this document come from, and this information? Is it accurate?" Today, after the negotiation between Panasonic and Seagram, this document began to circulate. Now, the assistant glanced at Michael Ovitz again, and there seemed to be a hint of schadenfreude in his eyes. Now the entire Hollywood is spreading it. I think it should be accurate. Nobuyuki Ide nodded slightly and waved his hand to ask the assistant to leave. He carefully read the document in his hand and frowned. Then he sighed softly and passed the document to Michael Ovitz, who already had an uneasy look on his face. "Mr. Ovitz, let's talk about the cooperation later. I think you should deal with this matter now." Michael Ovitz took the document. After flipping through a few pages, his face changed. He stood up abruptly and said to Nobuyuki Ide, "Mr. Ide, I'm sorry, I think I need to leave." Michael Ovitz hurriedly walked out of the office. His body was trembling slightly as he got into his car. After instructing the driver to start the car, he opened the document again. He was getting angrier and angrier. The document in his hand listed a lot of evidence that he was not suitable to be the CEO of Worldwide. But from Michael Ovitz's point of view, this document was trying to ruin his career in Hollywood. Just the fact that he spent $2 million to renovate his office made Michael Ovitz feel that his chances of cooperating with Sony were very slim. This was because in the end, the media's biggest criticism of Peter Guber and Chong Peters was that they spent too much money in Columbia. But Michael Ovitz felt that he had the ability to enjoy such treatment. Many leaders in Hollywood also enjoyed such treatment. But after experiencing Peter Guber's extravagance, Sony would surely be wary of such treatment. Then he poached other record companies to expand Universal's record business, increased investment in the TV department, and invited A-list superstars to cooperate with Universal. These were all suggestions that he had made before. In the eyes of the people who concocted the information, all of them became evidence of his desire for grandiosity. Although their friendship was broken, Michael Ovitz still didn't expect that Michael Eisner would use such drastic measures to deal with him in order to squeeze him out of Worldwide. I had already decided to leave Worldwide. Why are you still doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me? The more he thought about it, the angrier Michael Ovitz got. He picked up the mobile phone beside him and dialed Michael Eisner's number with trembling hands. When the call connected, Michael Ovitz gritted his teeth and shouted, "Fine. You have achieved your goal. Let me tell you, Michael. Don't even think about kicking me out of Worldwide. I will use a chain to tie myself to Worldwide's desk." Chapter 676. The report accusing Michael Ovitz was on the headlines of almost all the first-line media outlets the next day. As a big shot in the agency industry who had single-handedly created CAA and used the packaging mechanism to greatly increase the cost of the entire Hollywood production, the report accusing Michael Ovitz of being incompetent caused a controversy. It was difficult for the outside world to understand what had happened in Hollywood. They could only find out through the media. The internal conflict that Universal had been trying to cover up finally broke out. The rumor that Michael Eisner had repeatedly denied in news interviews that he had a conflict with Michael Ovitz was also confirmed. Although most people could only see the surface of this matter, on the night of the incident, Eric knew the whole story in detail. Michael Eisner desperately wanted to use this deal to kick Michael Ovitz out of Global, while Seagram was in the process of acquiring Global, so that he could consolidate his power. In order to reduce the cost of firing Michael Ovitz, Michael Eisner had the idea of letting Panasonic bear the cost of Michael Ovitz's resignation. For this reason, he had specially prepared such a report. As Sony's arch-rival in the electronics industry, Panasonic did not have the awareness of being a sucker like Sony. Therefore, they leaked the information that Michael Eisner had collated and tried to include in the negotiation terms to the media. Although Panasonic did not make any public comments on the information, through this action, their attitude was very simple. This was Hollywood's internal conflict, and Panasonic would not be able to pay for it. Panasonic acted as if they were going to leave and did not care about anything else. However, they had stirred up a mess in Hollywood. Although the report accusing Michael Ovitz was full of Michael Eisner's personal bias, the content was not fabricated. Therefore, after verifying the authenticity of the report, Sony immediately dismissed the idea of letting Michael Ovitz take charge of Columbia. Just like what Michael Ovitz thought when he saw the report, just the fact that he had spent $2 million to renovate his office made Sony, who had just experienced the pain of Peter Guber's squandering, give up on inviting him. For Worldwide, the irreconcilable conflict between the two leaders had been forcefully torn apart, directly delaying the last step of negotiations between Panasonic and Seagram. Both sides knew very well that if this matter wasn't resolved, it would be very difficult to reach the final deal. After being slandered by Michael Eisner, Michael Ovitz knew that it would be difficult for him to find another company. The hope of returning to the agent industry was even slimmer. Therefore, just like how he roared at Michael Eisner on the phone, Michael Ovitz started to go to work on time at Worldwide every day. It was as if he really wanted to tie himself to Worldwide's desk. However, he no longer had any direct communication with Michael Eisner. With the Golden Parachute Agreement protecting him, Michael Ovitz was like a hedgehog in Worldwide, making it difficult for people to bite him. Although he faintly regretted throwing out the report too hastily, Michael Eisner could not admit that he was in the wrong. Because in Western society, admitting one's mistake meant that one had to bear the responsibility. The helmer of a large corporation often only had one way to bear the responsibility, which was to admit his fault and resign. This kind of result was definitely not something Michael Eisner was willing to bear. Therefore, in the subsequent interview process, in order to gain the approval and support of the media, Michael Eisner completely abandoned the firm friendship with Michael Ovitz that he had once publicly declared, and openly discussed the accuracy of the report. After spending Thanksgiving in the hustle and bustle of the media, Eric hurriedly returned to New York to do the latest post-production work for the upcoming broadcast of Victoria's Secret annual show on December 6th. Even so, Eric's eyes were always fixed on the City of Angels on the West Coast. If it had been a few years ago, Eric would have only been able to stand by and watch the mess that was happening in Hollywood. However, now he was thinking about how to further intervene and modify the structure of Hollywood through this incident. The development of the Firefly Group had reached a peak. Eric's next plan was to take control of the entire Hollywood step by step. This idea, which seemed whimsical to outsiders, was not unrealistic for Eric. First of all, Eric already had enough economic strength. Even if he did not consider the assets controlled by Firefly Investments, just the Firefly Group in the media field alone, the initial payment of the 2 asset sales this year and the annual operating profit of the group, excluding the necessary tax expenses, could still bring about $2.5 billion of free cash flow to Firefly. The operating cash flow of all the companies in the entire Firefly Group system was almost 3 times the free cash flow. With tens of billions of USD in cash reserves, if Eric was willing, Firefly could even take over the 2 companies in the hands of the Japanese, Columbia and Universal. However, if Firefly really did this, it would definitely cause uneasiness and fear throughout Hollywood and trigger an antitrust investigation by relevant agencies. Therefore, everything could only be done slowly in a subtle way. In this regard, Eric undoubtedly had another big advantage, and that was time. Even if it took 10 years to control the entire process of Hollywood, Eric would only be 35 years old by then. He would be in the prime of his life. Many people even just started their own careers at this age. Compared to the sunshine all year round in Los Angeles, just after Thanksgiving, the entire East Coast ushered in the first heavy snow of winter. Early in the morning, a black Chrysler was parked outside a high-rise apartment near Central Park at the entrance of 6th Avenue. Kelly got out of the car with the documents in her hands, gave a few instructions to the driver and assistant in the car, and walked into the high-rise apartment with her neck shrunk as she stepped on the road that had not yet been cleared of snow. She came to the door of Eric's apartment on the top floor and reached out to press the doorbell. After hesitating for a moment, the female assistant took out the key, opened the door and walked in. The cold light after the snow stopped in the morning passed through the spacious living room covered by the glass curtain wall. At this time, the living room was filled with a lot of messy documents. The laptop screen on the coffee table in the middle of the living room was still on. This messy scene was out of place in this luxurious penthouse that overlooked the entire Central Park. Kelly even felt that she had suddenly arrived at the home of a Frankenstein monster. Taking off her thick windbreaker and boots, Kelly changed into slippers at the entrance and walked into the living room. At first glance, she saw Eric lying on the sofa in the living room with a blanket covering him, snoring loudly. This situation made Kelly feel both amused and puzzled. Sometimes this little man's requirements for quality of life were as strict as those of a rich family's son, and he even had obvious misophobia. But sometimes he was as casual as a homeless person, as if he was very satisfied with being able to eat and sleep well. Walking softly to Eric's side, Kelly gently put the documents in her hand on the coffee table, leaned over the sofa, and carefully stroked the messy hair in front of Eric's forehead with a gentle smile. She wanted to lean over and kiss him, but she was afraid of waking Eric up, so she did not move. Instead, she got up and walked to the kitchen. She quietly cut the bread and put it in the spit. Then she heated up the milk. The female assistant was about to make an omelet when she felt a pair of big hands hugging her from behind. Kelly turned her head and allowed Eric to kiss her cheek. She smiled and said, "You're awake. Go and wash up. Breakfast will be ready soon." Eric was infatuated with the female assistant's neck and sniffed the mesmerizing fragrance for a while before letting go of Kelly, who was already weak all over, and walking to the bathroom. After a while, Kelly put the breakfast she had made in front of Eric and sat down on the other side. She then asked, "Why did you sleep on the sofa last night? What if you caught a cold?" Eric picked up the cutlery and answered, I was thinking about some things, and unknowingly fell asleep on the sofa. Kelly curiously asked, was it something very important? This is a good opportunity for us. Since the Japanese are not willing to sell, as an outsider, they will need a partner. Firefly can also continue to get profits from Columbia. I had thought about this last night, and I will discuss it with Katzenberg and the rest in the next few days. If the Japanese stay, it will only benefit us. That's why we need to take the initiative to lure them. Kelly smiled and suddenly thought of something. She hesitated for a while and said, Eric, the Japanese company's board of directors you mentioned earlier is very similar to Firefly's. Eric looked at Kelly's cautious expression and laughed. I had also thought about this last night. Kelly was surprised. What's the result? Eric shrugged. The result is that I am not even 25 years old. I don't need to think so far ahead. Kelly was stunned for a moment before she laughed out loud. That's right, Eric was not yet 25 years old. Not 75 years old like Morita Akio. There was absolutely no problem with Firefly's current development, and Eric did not need to plan in this regard at all. In fact, I'm also thinking that although I can still maintain a clear state of mind now, 10 or 20 years later, I'm likely to be as stubborn as Morita Akio and buy Columbia at a high price. Then, I realized I am starting to have this tendency. That's why I reflect on myself. Kelly was surprised. Huh? Do you still remember Qualcomm? Eric asked. Kelly nodded. You did not mention it recently, and I thought you had forgotten about it. Chapter 677. Recently, whenever he had free time, Eric would take the time to study the information of Qualcomm that Kelly had collected for him. As a technical illiterate who knew nothing about mobile communications, Eric also spent a lot of effort to understand the advantages of Qualcomm's CDMA system's code division multiple access technology, compared to the time division multiple access technology of the second-generation communication system, such as GSM. At the same time, Eric also found that Qualcomm was currently at the lowest point in its development process. The mobile communications industry was rapidly shifting from the analog signal era to the digital signal era. The second-generation mobile communications technology was very mature and had entered the commercial stage. Although Qualcomm had proved the superiority of its CDMA technology over 2G through many experiments and tests, so far, there was not a single CDMA commercial operation network in the world. Recalling the information he had recently read, Eric said to Kelly, I found that I took Qualcomm's problem for granted. At first, I thought that since CDMA technology was better than GSM technology, and Qualcomm was now in a difficult situation, I would invest a sum of money in it, and spare no effort to support Qualcomm's development. It would definitely make this company a leader in the industry. But the fact is more complicated than I thought. Qualcomm's current situation involves the development direction of the entire mobile communications industry in the Federation. The establishment of any mobile communications network involves billions, or even tens of billions of dollars of investment. Once a certain communication system is established, even if this communication system is behind other technologies, it is still impossible to change in a short time. Therefore, the process of developing a communication standard involving a multi-sided game of interests is not something that can be decided by just saying my technology is better. There are too many cases in the world where bad money drives out good money. So if I rashly invest in Qualcomm, it is likely that I will lose everything in the end. Kelly listened quietly to Eric's words. Eric had solemnly instructed her to collect information about Qualcomm. The female assistant had also studied Qualcomm's information in detail in private, and had a deep understanding of Qualcomm's situation. Not to mention that the major communication operators in the United States were in dispute over technical standards. Qualcomm also had a conflict of interest with the operators. In the beginning, Qualcomm was like an outsourcing businessman that developed customized wireless communication solutions for communication companies. In this process, many communication operators held shares of Qualcomm through capital injection. This kind of interest relationship was actually a potential advantage for Qualcomm in the communication system competition. However, if Eric forcefully squeezed into the ranks of major shareholders of Qualcomm with his strong financial resources and diluted the shares held by the operator, it would definitely weaken the competitive advantage of CDMA. It might even cause Qualcomm to lose to standards such as GSM in the final mobile communication technology standard and become a marginal technology. If it were in the past, Kelly would definitely hope that Eric would not rashly invest in Qualcomm. But at this time, listening to Eric's introspection, the female assistant's tender eyes were filled with admiration. A man standing at the top of the pyramid could still maintain such sobriety and rationality. Kelly felt that she was a little obsessed with this little man. At the same time, she dispelled the idea of letting Eric withdraw. She said, "Eric, San Diego is only more than 100 kilometers away from Los Angeles. I mean, why don't you take the time to talk to Owen Jacobs, the CEO of Qualcomm, after you're done with the things here? No matter how detailed the information we collect is, it certainly can't be compared with the information held by the founder of Qualcomm. Maybe you can get unexpected results after you get in touch." Eric looked at the female assistant and smiled. "Didn't you disapprove of my investment in Qualcomm? That was in the past. Now that you have a very clear understanding of this matter, there's nothing wrong with giving it a try. Moreover, I think that your point of view just now completely ignores your current personal influence. With the capital in your hands now, if you fully support Qualcomm, it will definitely be able to gain a greater advantage in the competition of mobile communication standards." Eric had originally given up the idea of intervening in Qualcomm. He only planned to slowly absorb a part of Qualcomm's shares through Firefly investment and become a moderate shareholder. But when he heard Kelly's words, he could not help but be a little moved. However, after considering his work schedule, Eric's face showed a helpless expression again. Even if he could find time to meet Owen Jacobs, he could not spend too much energy on Qualcomm. He had too many things to pay attention to now. Originally, this project could have been handed over to Firefly Investment, but Chris's personal energy was also limited. As several major companies under Firefly Investment began to develop rapidly, Chris was also very busy. In recent months, in order to solve the personnel and production adjustment problems caused by Nokia's rapid expansion, Chris had been flying for several months in a row. He only hurried back to the United States before Thanksgiving. Hearing Eric's concerns, Kelly reached out and patted the back of Eric's hand. She said, "Eric, there's still me. What about us? You don't have to take everything on yourself. Many of us can help you." "Okay." Eric grabbed Kelly's small hand that was about to withdraw and squeezed it. He said smugly, "In this case, maybe I need to plan well and allocate some of my energy to Qualcomm." Although he had made up his mind, the earliest meeting with Qualcomm CEO, Owen Jacobs, could only be arranged after the new year. In December, commercial films such as Mission Impossible and Runaway Bride continued to reap the box office. With the advent of the awards season, Braveheart, which was originally handed over to Fox and operated by the Wayne Stam brothers, also began to be released on a small scale. Firefly also released Lion, The Professional, directed by Luc Besson at the end of the year. At the same time, the turmoil in Hollywood continued. Sony finally announced a $2.1 billion write-down of Columbia Pictures assets. This news shocked the entire capital market. After the news was announced, Sony's founder and chairman, Morita Akio, submitted his resignation letter to the board of directors. Although in order to protect the reputation of the business tycoon who founded Sony, Sony publicly stated that Morita Akio's resignation had nothing to do with the Columbia incident, not many people believed it. At Universal, Michael Ovitz's resignation was a foregone conclusion. However, the issue of Michael Ovitz's sky-high severance pay eventually became a dispute between Panasonic, Seagram, and Michael Eisner. Panasonic believed that the Golden Parachute Agreement was Michael Eisner's personal mistake. Therefore, if Seagram insisted on Michael Ovitz's resignation, the compensation should be borne by Michael Eisner. Michael Eisner insisted that Michael Ovitz's Golden Parachute Agreement was approved by Panasonic's board of directors and had nothing to do with him. Seagram knew very well that Universal's future operations could not be separated from Michael Eisner. He could only put pressure on Panasonic, and even vaguely threatened that if Panasonic did not compromise, Seagram would change his target to Columbia. While paying close attention to the situation in Hollywood, Eric completed the editing of the Victoria's Secret television broadcast version in early December, and once again focused on the final stage of Victoria's Secret's marketing. In order to expand the influence of the Victoria's Secret brand as much as possible, after the editing of the television broadcast version was completed, Eric asked Firefly's distribution department to start producing videotapes of the television version. Before December 6, the first batch of 1 million videotapes had been produced. After the television broadcast was completed, they could immediately be distributed nationwide. December 6, Tuesday. Although it was long past the end of the working day, there were still many people gathered at ABC's headquarters on 66th Street. This was because today was not only the broadcast of the final episode of the first season of Survivor, which was likely to create a ratings miracle, but it was also the broadcast day of the long-promoted Victoria's Secret annual show. ABC had just experienced a fruitful fall season. The three ace shows, Friends, Survivor, and Emergency Room Stories, were aired one after another. Their viewership numbers were all in the red, and they firmly occupied the #1 position in the market share of the public television stations. Among them, the reality show Survivor had created a new viewership miracle. The average viewership for the first 12 episodes had reached more than 33 million. Therefore, every employee who was asked to work overtime at ABC's headquarters today was filled with excitement and joy. Not only was it because the final episode of the first season of Survivor would bring high viewership ratings, but it was also because after the viewership numbers were released, the company's senior executives would definitely hold a grand party to celebrate. In the large conference room at ABC's headquarters, there were more than a dozen people gathered. However, compared to the broadcast of Survivor, this time, the people gathered in this conference room were mainly people from the Victoria's Secret project team. In addition to Eric, Edward Razek, Emily and others, there were also 5 Victoria's Secret spokespersons who were invited. Because they knew that the final episode of Survivor was destined to be a huge success, ABC did not make it as big of a fanfare as when it first aired. Only Robert Iger appeared on the scene. Tom Murphy was already old, so he got off work early and went home. Katzenberg also did not fly over from Los Angeles. In addition to the Victoria's Secret TV show that started at 9 o'clock, the Yahoo portal would also open a popularity poll for the Victoria's Secret Angels. In the conference room, Cindy Crawford looked at Eric sitting at the conference table and skillfully tapping on the laptop keyboard to communicate with Tina Brown, who was also working overtime in Boston. She rolled her eyes and got up to go out for a while. Soon, she came back with a laptop. Behind her was a male employee with a fawning look on his face. He eagerly helped Cindy Crawford connect the network cable to the internet. When Linda Evangelista and the other women saw Cindy Crawford's actions, they surrounded her and gathered in front of the laptop, talking about it with great interest. Emily, who was sitting next to Eric, looked at the actions of the women, and pulled Chris next to her with a sour tone. Beautiful women are really born with privileges. I also want a laptop. Why doesn't anyone lend me one? Chris, who was focused on reading a magazine, got up helplessly and said, "Okay, I'll help you borrow one." Really women. Emily's beautiful eyes widened slightly. What are you muttering about? Chris didn't answer. He walked out of the conference room in a hurry, causing a series of laughter. Emily was also a little embarrassed. She could only pretend to look at her watch, then picked up the document in front of her and poked Eric, who was whispering to Eric. "Hey Eric, the 1 million videotapes cost more than 5 million to produce. Do you think anyone would be willing to spend $30 to buy a short film that is only 40 minutes long?" Eric was also a little uncertain, but he had already thought of a solution. He said, "If no one wants to buy it, then give it away. Carry out various activities through the Yahoo portal, and even give it as a gift in the Victoria's Secret chain store. I didn't intend to use the videotape sales to make money. The 1 million videotapes are just like the internal mail order catalog of Victoria's Secret. The main purpose is still to promote. Of course, all the expenses for this year's Victoria's Secret show will be paid by me. From next year onwards, Ltd will have to pay for it themselves. Emily smiled and nodded. Because of the misgivings about the advertising effect of the show, Ltd had transferred the production rights of the Victoria's Secret show to Eric. Now, just based on the stock price, Ltd's market value had increased by more than $1 billion. Not to mention next year, even if Eric asked Ltd to compensate him for the production budget, the board of directors would definitely approve. Seeing her boyfriend come back with a laptop, Emily moved to the side. She thought of the episode of Survivor that was broadcast before the Victoria's Secret show and asked curiously, "Eric, how many viewers do you think the last episode of Survivor will reach?" As soon as she said this, everyone in the office, who had been doing their own things, quieted down at the same time and looked at Eric. Eric shrugged and pointed to the electronic clock on the wall of the conference room. He said, "Everyone will know in half an hour. I believe everyone will be shocked." There was a sigh of regret around. Robert Iger, who was sitting next to Eric, asked a few more questions with a smile, hoping that Eric could give a prediction. Eric just shook his head and said nothing. This made everyone look forward to the viewership numbers even more. After the last episode of Survivor was broadcast, the preliminary viewership numbers from Nielsen really surprised everyone. Survivor's viewership numbers had just reached 38 million last week, but the last episode had just started and the viewership numbers had already reached a high of 49 million. After that, it kept climbing. When the final results of the reality show competition were released, the viewership numbers had reached 56 million. Hearing this amazing viewership number, Emily looked at Robert Iger, who was excitedly standing in the corner of the conference room with a mobile phone in his hand. She asked Eric, 56 million, what will the viewership numbers of the Victoria's Secret show reach? Eric had already expected this, so he was not as surprised and excited as the others. He looked at the big screen color TV in the conference room and said, according to the experience of shows with high viewership such as the Super Bowl, the average viewership of the Victoria's Secret show should be half of that of the show. Of course, after such a long promotion, I think the viewership numbers will definitely be higher than usual. TSK, even if it's only half, it's still 28 million, Emily said excitedly. I'm looking forward to the stock market opening tomorrow. The market value of Ltd is only a little short of $4 billion. As she said that, the big screen color TV finished playing an advertisement. The screen flashed and the silver versus logo of Victoria's Secret appeared on the screen. After a line of subtitles that reminded the audience that they could participate in the Victoria's Secret show's popular Angel Vote through the Yahoo portal. In the night view of Manhattan, the sound of drums sounded from afar. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.